Close your eyes now, if you have not already done so, and let the weight of your body settle into whatever softness surrounds you, whether that is a mattress or a blanket, or the quiet warmth of a pillow shaped just so beneath your head. There is nothing you need to do tonight, nowhere you need to be, nothing urgent waiting for you at the other side of this darkness. The world outside your window has grown still. The sounds that reach you now are distant and gentle. The low hum of a city in its nighttime mood. The occasional breath of wind moving through the spaces between buildings. Perhaps the quiet creak of the house as it settles into the cool of the evening. You are safe here. You are warm here. And there is a story to tell, a long and slow and very old story, one that asks nothing of you, except that you let it carry you gently into sleep. We are going to travel together through time tonight. You and I, moving backward through centuries, the way a leaf drifts downstream, without urgency, without direction, simply carried by the current of history. We are going to visit the physicians and the apothecaries, the surgeons and the scholars, the well-meaning men and women who stood at the bedsides of the sick and did everything they knew to do, which was sometimes, and this is the quiet heart of our story tonight, the very thing that made things worse. If this voice helps you rest, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, but only if you are still awake. And if you are already beginning to drift, then simply let these words become the soft sound of the past, washing over you like warm water, carrying you further and further from the bright, sharp world of the waking day. Let your breath slow now, let your shoulders fall, and let us begin. There is a particular quality to the candlelight of the ancient world, to the firelight of any world before electricity, which is the way it flickers and wavers without ever quite going out, casting long-moving shadows across the walls of rooms where the sick lay, waiting, and the healers moved with their pouches of herbs and their clay vessels and their deep, sincere conviction that what they were doing was right. The physicians of antiquity did not doubt themselves, at least not in the way that we might expect, because what they had, instead of modern science, was something older, and in some ways more powerful, which was a complete and internally consistent theory of how the human body worked, and why it sometimes failed to work, and what might be done about that failure. This theory, which had its origins in the writings of the ancient Greeks, and was elaborated upon, and refined across many centuries by scholars in Alexandria and Persia and Rome, and the great libraries of medieval Europe, was the theory of the four humours. It held that the human body was governed by four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health was nothing more or less than the perfect balance of these four substances within the body, while illness was simply the result of that balance being disturbed, of one humour becoming too abundant or too deficient, too hot or too cold, too wet or too dry. It was an elegant theory, one that had a kind of soothing internal logic to it, and for roughly 2,000 years, from the time of Hippocrates in the 5th century, before the Common Era, to the slow intellectual revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, it governed the practice of medicine across much of the known world. Hippocrates himself, born around 460 years before the Common Era on the island of Kos in the Aegean Sea, is credited with the earliest systematic attempts to understand illness as a natural phenomenon rather than a supernatural one. And his work, collected in what scholars call the Hippocratic corpus, a vast body of medical writings assembled over generations, formed the foundation upon which all Western medicine would be built for centuries to come. The humoral theory was not his alone, but it was associated with his name and his school, and it was carried forward with great authority by the physician Galen of Pergamon who lived from approximately 129 to 216 of the Common Era, and who served as physician to gladiators and to Roman emperors, and who wrote so prolifically and so persuasively that his influence on medical thought persisted almost unchallenged for over 14 centuries after his death. Galen believed, as Hippocrates had believed before him, that the most common cause of illness was an excess of blood in the body, and that the remedy for this excess was both simple and logical, which was to remove some of the blood, to let it flow out of the body, and thereby restore the balance that illness had disrupted. This practice, which we know as bloodletting, or phlebotomy, or venesection depending on the era and the method, was not a fringe idea or a desperate measure of last resort. It was the first and most trusted tool in the physician's kit, recommended for fevers and infections and swellings and headaches and chest pains and dozens of other conditions, applied to patients young and old, rich and poor, in climates ranging from the warm Mediterranean to the cold northern reaches of medieval Europe. The lancet, which was the small sharp knife used to open a vein, was as common in the physician's bag as the stethoscope would one day become. The bleeding bowl, a shallow ceramic or metal dish used to collect the blood that flowed from the opened vein, was a fixture of the sick room, and the patient who submitted to this procedure did so not with fear or resistance, but often with gratitude and relief, because the physician who recommended it spoke with the authority of Galen and Hippocrates, and all the accumulated weight of ancient wisdom, and because, sometimes, in ways that modern medicine can only partially explain, the patient actually did feel better afterward, or at least felt that they would feel better, which was not always the same thing, but was not always different either. It is worth pausing here, in the soft warmth of this early chapter, to consider what it meant to be a physician in the ancient world, or the medieval world, or even the early modern world of the 17th century, when the humoral theory still held sway, and the tools of medicine were largely unchanged from those Galen had employed in Rome more than 1,000 years before. It meant, for one thing, to have studied for many years, to have read deeply in the classical texts, to have memorized the writings of Avicenna, the Persian scholar whose canon of medicine, completed around the year 1025, synthesized the Greek tradition with the medical knowledge of the Islamic world, and became a standard textbook in European universities for centuries, and to have learned by apprenticeship at the bedside of an experienced practitioner the 1,000 small observations and judgments that could not be conveyed in writing. It meant, in other words, to be genuinely learned, genuinely dedicated, and genuinely convinced of the rightness of what one was doing. At the tragedy of humoral medicine, if we are to call it a tragedy, and it is perhaps more accurate to call it simply the condition of human knowledge, before a certain point, was not that it was practiced by ignorant or malicious people. The healers who bled their patients and purged them, and applied poultices of mustard and rue were not villains. They were men, and occasionally women, who had devoted their lives to the relief of suffering, and who operated within the best intellectual framework available to them. The sorrowful truth, which we will trace slowly across these chapters, is simply that the framework was often wrong, and that being wrong in medicine, in ways that well-meaning people cannot at the time perceive, has consequences that fall upon the bodies of the sick. The blood that flowed into the bleeding bowl was real blood. The weakness that followed excessive bloodletting was a real weakness. And the patients who died in the sick rooms of the ancient and medieval world, surrounded by physicians doing everything they knew to do, sometimes died not only of their illnesses, but also of their cures, which is the long and quiet story we are here to tell together in the night. Throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, the practice of bloodletting was intertwined with a broader system of medicine that included purging, which involved the administration of substances intended to evacuate the bowels, or induce vomiting, and the application of heat and cold through hot baths and cold compresses, and the careful regulation of diet and sleep and exercise, all in service of the restoration of humoral balance. The Greek physician Erasistratus of Chios, who lived in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and who studied anatomy with some rigor in Alexandria, actually doubted the value of bloodletting and preferred to treat plethora, or excess blood, with diet and exercise rather than with the lancet. But Erasistratus was the exception rather than the rule, and the weight of medical authority across the ancient world came down firmly on the side of the lancet and the bleeding bowl. In Rome, the practice was so widespread and so accepted that it was performed not only by trained physicians, but by barbers who combined the cutting of hair and beard with the opening of veins as a matter of professional routine, giving rise to the familiar red and white striped pole that still marks barbershops in many parts of the world today. The red representing blood, the white representing the bandages used to bind the opened vein afterward. The barber surgeon, as this practitioner came to be known in medieval Europe, occupied a curious position in the social hierarchy of medicine, below the university-educated physician who concerned himself primarily with diagnosis and the prescription of remedies, but above the simple herbalist or midwife in terms of the procedures he was licensed to perform. And among those procedures, bloodletting occupied a place of particular prominence, performed in the back rooms of barbershops, and in the homes of the wealthy, and in the wards of the great medieval hospitals, with a frequency and a confidence that would seem, to modern eyes, somewhere between remarkable and deeply sorrowful. There were detailed treatises written in the medieval period on the correct technique of bloodletting, on which vein to open for which condition, on how much blood to remove, and at what time of day and in what season of the year, since the humoral theorists believed that the seasons affected the balance of the humors just as the phases of the moon affected the tides. The vein in the arm, called the median cubital, was the most commonly opened. The veins of the forehead and the neck were opened in cases of head complaints. The veins behind the knees were opened for conditions affecting the lower body. And in all cases, the physician or barber surgeon watched the blood flow into the bowl with the attentiveness of a craftsman observing the product of his work, assessing its color and consistency, noting whether it was thin and pale or thick and dark, whether it clotted quickly or slowly. All of these observations feeding into the ongoing assessment of the patient's humoral state, and the decision about whether more blood needed to be removed or whether the day's work was done. The passage of centuries did not diminish the practice of bloodletting. It persisted with remarkable tenacity through the medieval period and into the Renaissance and beyond, surviving even the great intellectual upheavals of the 16th and 17th centuries. When the work of Andreas Vesalius, whose De Humani Corporis Fabrica, was published in 1543, and demonstrated through careful dissection that many of Galen's anatomical claims were simply wrong, and the work of William Harvey, whose Exercitatio Anatomica de Motu Cordis et Sanguinis in Animalibus, published in 1628, proved conclusively that blood circulated through the body in a closed loop rather than being continuously produced and consumed, as Galen had believed, began to undermine the theoretical foundations upon which humoral medicine rested. Harvey's discovery was, in retrospect, one of the most important moments in the history of medicine. A clean and elegant proof that the blood the physicians had been removing from their patients for 2,000 years was not a substance produced in excess and requiring periodic removal, but rather a finite resource circulating ceaselessly through arteries and veins, driven by the rhythmic contractions of the heart. If Harvey was right, and careful experiment showed that he was, then the entire premise of bloodletting was built on a misunderstanding of how the body worked, and yet the practice did not stop. The physicians of Europe read Harvey's work, acknowledged its brilliance, and in many cases continued to bleed their patients with minimal modification to their approach, because the theory of the humours was so deeply embedded in medical education and medical culture that no single discovery, however elegant, could dislodge it overnight. The medical establishment of the 17th century, like medical establishments in most eras, was not organized for rapid change. It was organized for the transmission and preservation of established knowledge, and the established knowledge said that blood was to be let when illness struck, and so blood was let. During this period, in the years surrounding Harvey's discovery, and in the decades that followed, it is worth noting that the patients who lay in the sicks of Europe and the Americas had no way of knowing whether what was being done to them was right or wrong, and in most cases, they had no meaningful way to refuse it either, since the physician commanded a social authority that made resistance seem not only impolite, but dangerous to one's recovery. A sick man who refused the recommendation of his physician was a sick man who had to face his illness without the protection of official medicine, which was a frightening prospect in a world where illness killed with speed and apparent randomness, and where the mechanisms of disease were entirely invisible to ordinary observation. And so the sick consented, as they always had, and the lancets were applied, and the blood flowed into the bowls, and sometimes the patients improved, as patients with robust constitutions often do regardless of the treatment administered, and sometimes they did not improve, and sometimes they worsened, and sometimes they died, and in all of these cases, the physician recorded his observations and drew his conclusions within a framework that was not capable of accurately distinguishing between the effect of the treatment and the natural course of the illness. This is not a criticism of any individual physician. It is simply a description of the condition of medicine before the development of the controlled clinical trial, before the concept of the placebo, before the statistical tools that would allow researchers in the 19th and 20th centuries to determine whether a treatment was actually doing what its practitioners believed it was doing. In the centuries before those tools existed, medicine advanced with agonizing slowness, each era compounding upon those that came before it, each generation inheriting not only the knowledge of its predecessors, but also their mistakes. And then there came a morning in December, in the year 1799, when a man woke in his Virginia home with a painful throat and a rasping breath and called for his physician. And the series of events that followed would become, in the centuries since, one of the most frequently cited examples of a patient harmed by the medicine intended to save him. The man was George Washington, 67 years old, recently retired from the presidency of the young United States, living at his estate at Mount Vernon on the banks of the Potomac River. He woke at approximately 2 a.m. of December 14th with a severe inflammation of the throat, most likely, according to the analysis of modern medical historians, the result of acute bacterial epiglottitis, a dangerous swelling of the tissue at the base of the tongue, that can obstruct the airway, and if untreated or mistreated, kill within hours. Washington was a man who believed in the power of bloodletting, having used it on members of his household before, and when his overseer Albin Rawlins arrived in the early morning hours, Washington asked to be bled immediately before the physicians had even arrived. Rawlins, following the instructions of the former president, removed somewhere between 12 and 14 ounces of blood from Washington's arm. The physicians came later that morning, and they bled him again, and then a fourth and final time. And when the day was done, George Washington had lost what modern estimates place at somewhere between 32 and 40 ounces of blood, or roughly 40% of the total blood volume in his body. He died that evening, on December 14, 1799, as the short winter light faded, and the candles burned low in the rooms of Mount Vernon, and among those who attended his final hours, there was no doubt, no hesitation, no suspicion that anything had been done incorrectly. The physicians had done precisely what their training told them to do. They had done it with care and with dedication. And the man who had been the first president of the United States had, in all likelihood, been bled to death. What makes the death of Washington so deeply sorrowful and so useful as a point of entry into this long history is not the drama of it, not the famous name or the grand setting, but the perfect ordinariness of it, the way it illustrates, without exaggeration or embellishment, exactly what happened to countless thousands of less famous patients in the centuries, before medicine developed the tools to examine its own assumptions. Washington was bled because it was the correct thing to do, according to every authority that mattered at the time. His physicians, Craik and Brown and Dick, were not incompetent men. They were trained practitioners applying the standard of care. And the standard of care, on that cold December morning in Virginia, was killing the patient it was meant to save. Over the next century, the understanding of what had happened at Mount Vernon would slowly become clearer as the humoral theory lost its grip on medical education and new frameworks of understanding disease began to emerge. Frameworks based not on ancient authority, but on careful observation, and eventually on the germ theory of disease, on the identification of bacteria and viruses, and the mechanisms by which they caused illness in the body. But this clarity came slowly, and in the meantime, the lancets were still sharpened, and the bleeding bowls were still used, and many more patients who deserved better continued to be carried away by the very measures meant to carry them through. In the soft distance of history, it is possible to listen to the story of bloodletting the way one listens to a very old piece of music, hearing in it not only the sadness of the mistakes, but also the strange beauty of the effort, the recognition that human beings have always tried to care for one another in the face of suffering, and that the history of medicine is in part the history of that effort, even in its most sorrowful chapters. The humoral theory, for all that it led its practitioners into harm, was also the product of an impulse toward understanding, toward finding patterns in the world and using them to help the sick. The physicians who applied the lancet at the bedside of George Washington were not indifferent to human suffering. They were doing what the long tradition of their profession told them was right. And that tradition, stretching back through Galen and Hippocrates across more than 2,000 years, was not nothing. It was the accumulated effort of countless minds working over countless generations to make sense of the mystery of the body in health and in illness, and the fact that they arrived at some conclusions that were wrong does not erase the genuineness of the effort. The history of medicine is not a simple story of progress from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge, from harm to healing. It is a more complicated story, quieter and slower and more human than that. Are stories of people doing their best with what they knew, and of the ways in which the best is sometimes not enough, and of the slow and sometimes painful process by which one generation's certainties become the next generation's cautionary tales. Meanwhile, in the centuries that overlapped with the long reign of the bleeding bowl, another cure was making its way through the pharmacopoeia of European medicine, one that would prove even more devastating in its effects, and one that would persist with even greater tenacity than bloodletting, because it seemed, in some cases, and under some conditions, to actually work. This was the use of mercury as a medical treatment, a practice with origins in the ancient world that found its most widespread and most tragic application in the treatment of syphilis, the sexually transmitted disease that swept across Europe with devastating speed, beginning in the mid-1490s. Mercury is a liquid metal, silver and heavy and strangely beautiful, and it had been known to the ancient world as a substance with peculiar properties used in the preparation of pigments and in certain alchemical processes and in small quantities as a remedy for skin conditions, since the ancients had observed that mercury applied to the skin seemed, in some circumstances, to produce changes in the appearance of certain lesions. When syphilis arrived in Europe, appearing with catastrophic force among the troops of the French army besieging Naples in 1495, and then spreading with extraordinary speed along the trade routes and military roads of the continent, the physicians of the day had no framework for understanding it, and no remedy specifically tailored to it, and so they reached for the tools that were already in the kit, including mercury, whose effects on skin conditions seemed, by the imperfect logic of the era, to make it a reasonable candidate for a disease whose most visible early symptoms included sores and lesions on the skin. Paracelsus, the Swiss-German physician born in 1493, who was known for his sharp, iconoclastic rejection of ancient authority and for his embrace of chemical remedies at a time when the herbal tradition dominated European medicine, formulated mercury as an ointment, and argued for its use in the treatment of syphilis, recognizing even then the toxicity of the metal and the importance of controlling the dose. His caution, however, was not universally shared, and the mercury that was applied to the bodies of syphilitic patients across Europe in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries was applied in doses and by methods that went far beyond what any careful consideration of the metal's known properties would have recommended. The methods by which mercury was administered to syphilitic patients were many and varied, and all of them carried risks that the physicians of the time were not well positioned to fully appreciate or to accurately weigh against the risks of the disease itself. Mercury was rubbed into the skin as an ointment, the patient lying before a fire or in a heated room while the substance was massaged into the arms and legs and torso, sometimes for hours at a time. It was administered as a vapor in steam baths, the patient sitting in an enclosed space, while mercury was heated below until it filled the air with its metallic fog and was inhaled into the lungs. It was taken orally in the form of pills, most famously the so-called blue mass pills that were popular from the 17th century well into the 19th, which contained mercurous chloride, also known as calomel, mixed with honey and licorice and various other substances intended to make the metallic taste more tolerable. It was in later years administered as a liquid compound through a green hose and various insertable attachments, a device developed by a French instrument maker that allowed physicians to deliver mercury preparations directly into the body through routes that would strike any modern reader as both ingenious and deeply unwise. The symptoms that resulted from this treatment were sometimes severe enough to be confused with the symptoms of the disease itself, which created a peculiarly circular kind of medical reasoning in which the presence of the treatment's toxic effects could be interpreted as evidence of its efficacy, as proof that the mercury was doing its work against the syphilis, when in fact it was simply poisoning the patient. The tremors that mercury caused were called mercurial tremors. The severe damage to the gums and teeth, which caused the teeth to loosen and fall out, and the jaw to develop open sores, was described in clinical terms as stomatitis, or inflammation of the mouth. The damage to the kidneys that could follow heavy mercury exposure resulted in a clinical deterioration that was often attributed to the progress of the underlying disease rather than to the treatment. And the profound neurological effects of mercury poisoning, the personality changes, and the depression and the condition described in the medical literature of the era as mercurial erethism, characterized by extreme timidity and social withdrawal, and what one source described with quiet accuracy as extreme sighing, were not systematically connected to the treatment in most physicians' minds, because the conceptual tools required to make that connection, the understanding of toxicology as a discipline, the ability to trace a substance through the body and observe its effects, were simply not yet available. It was not until the mid-19th century that the physiological effects of chronic mercury exposure began to be systematically studied, and even then the practice persisted, carried forward by the weight of 300 years of tradition and by the absence of anything demonstrably better. For over 3 centuries, from approximately 1495 until the introduction of the arsenic-based compound, salvarsan, by Paul Ehrlich in 1910, mercury remained the primary treatment for syphilis in Europe and in the European colonies that spread across the Americas and beyond, and the suffering this caused was immense and largely invisible, absorbed into the general category of the suffering of the sick, and not separated out or tallied or attributed specifically to the treatment. Historians who have examined the records of the period suggest that in many cases the mercury killed its patients before the syphilis would have done, so that the timeline of death was accelerated by the cure rather than reversed by it, that the men and women who died in the mercury baths and the blue mass regimens of the 17th and 18th centuries were, in a sorrowful number of instances, dying of their treatment. A 1910 article published in the medical literature examining cases of mercury poisoning, following the use of mercuric chloride as a douche, described one patient who developed kidney failure and vomiting of blood and died within a week of her consultation with a physician. A 1916 article in the British Medical Journal described another patient, 27 years old, who died within 6 days of a similar treatment, her death occurring not from syphilis, which she may or may not have had, but from the mercury compound administered in the course of her treatment. These were not exceptional cases. They were representative of a pattern that played out across centuries and across continents, a pattern in which the sincere desire to cure a devastating disease led generation after generation of well-meaning practitioners to administer a substance that was, in the doses, and by the methods commonly used, a significant cause of harm and death in its own right. The blue mass pill taken regularly by Abraham Lincoln in the years before his presidency to treat what his contemporaries described as hypochondria or melancholy contained enough mercury to cause the neurological and behavioral effects now associated with chronic mercury poisoning, and some historians have suggested, with appropriate scholarly caution, that the changes in Lincoln's personality and behavior noted by those around him during his presidency may in part reflect the accumulated neurological damage of years of mercurous chloride ingestion, though this remains a subject of ongoing historical and medical debate. During this same period, another metallic treatment was making its parallel journey through the arsenals of European medicine, one even more viscerally dangerous than mercury, and employed with similarly confident conviction by the practitioners who prescribed it. Arsenic, the pale and almost tasteless powder that would become notorious in the 19th century as the poison of choice in countless domestic crimes, and lurid sensation novels was also, paradoxically, a widely used medicine administered in liquid solutions, applied to the skin, used in enemas, and in some cases inhaled as a powder or ingested in compound preparations. The Fowler's solution of the late 18th century, developed by the English physician Thomas Fowler in 1786, was a preparation of potassium arsenite dissolved in water, and it was used for the treatment of a remarkable range of conditions, including malaria, psoriasis, and later, in the 19th century, certain forms of leukemia, with effects that were, in the case of the leukemia treatment at least, sometimes genuinely therapeutic, and presaged the use of arsenic derivatives in modern oncology. But arsenic in the doses commonly used for the treatment of syphilis and other conditions of the era was not a therapeutic compound in any sense that would survive modern scrutiny. Its side effects, which included persistent vomiting and disruption of the digestive system, and, with chronic exposure, damage to the peripheral nervous system, and a significantly elevated risk of certain cancers, were severe enough that any reasonable cost-benefit analysis would have precluded its use if such analysis had been available as a tool of medical reasoning at the time, which it largely was not. The physicians who prescribed Fowler's solution and its relatives did so in good faith, on the basis of observations that seemed, within the limits of what was knowable at the time, to support its use, and the patients who took it did so in the same spirit of trust in medical authority that has characterized the relationship between healer and patient across all of human history. Because the alternative, which was to suffer without treatment in an era before effective remedies existed, seemed worse than the treatment itself. It is worth noting, in this gentle drift through the mercury centuries, that the practitioners who administered these treatments were not without their doubters, that the history of harmful medicine is also, threaded through it like a quieter melody, a history of voices raised in uncertainty or outright opposition. Voices that were often, it must be said, dismissed or ignored or drowned out by the weight of established authority. In the 16th century, the Italian physician Fracastoro, who gave syphilis its name in his 1530 poem, Syphilis Sive Morbus Gallicus, expressed reservations about the severity of mercury treatments, even as he acknowledged their widespread use. In the 17th century, the English physician Thomas Sydenham, sometimes called the English Hippocrates, was more cautious in his use of both bloodletting and purging than many of his contemporaries, emphasizing the healing power of nature and the importance of not interfering too aggressively with the body's own recovery processes. And in the 18th century, the Scottish naval surgeon James Lind, who conducted what is sometimes called the first clinical trial in the history of medicine, when he systematically tested 6 different remedies for scurvy in 12 sailors aboard HMS Salisbury in 1747, and found that citrus, fruit, was the effective treatment, demonstrated that it was possible to apply something resembling experimental method to the evaluation of medical treatments, to compare rather than simply assert, to test rather than simply believe. Lynn's experiment was not immediately transformative. His findings, published in his treatise on the scurvy in 1753, were largely ignored for another 4 decades before the British Navy began routinely supplying sailors with lemon juice. But the principle it embodied, the principle that treatments should be tested against each other, or against no treatment at all, and that the results of such testing should guide medical practice, was a principle that would eventually, in the 19th and 20th centuries, transform medicine from a tradition into a science, and in doing so would reveal, systematically and sometimes devastatingly, just how many of the treatments that medicine had confidently employed for centuries were doing more harm than good. And so the mercury burned in its baths, and the blue mass pills were swallowed in the candlelit rooms of the sick, and the bleeding bowls filled and were emptied, and the patients who lay in those rooms received the best care their era could provide, which was sometimes not enough and sometimes actively harmful. And the centuries turned slowly, one into the next, carrying with them both the diseases and the cures, both the suffering and the sincere efforts to relieve it. The church bell in the distance tolls the hour. The candle burns low, and somewhere in the quiet past, a physician lifts his lancet with steady hands, and the patient closes their eyes, trusting, as patients have always trusted, that what comes next will be help rather than harm. The trust was usually genuine. The help was not always what it seemed to be. Over the next several decades, following the dawn of the 19th century, as the natural philosophers and the experimentalists and the anatomists of Europe and North America began to slowly dismantle the theoretical architecture of humoral medicine and replace it with something more closely resembling the medicine we would recognize today, the practice of bloodletting reached, with a kind of sorrowful irony, what historians of medicine have described as its peak in the English-speaking world. This peak was associated, above all, with the work and the influence of Benjamin Rush, the Philadelphia physician and signatory to the Declaration of Independence, who was also one of the most fervent and prolific advocates of aggressive bloodletting that the history of American medicine has produced. Rush was born in 1745 in Byberry, Pennsylvania, and he was educated in medicine at the University of Edinburgh, which was at that time one of the most prestigious medical schools in the world. And he returned to Philadelphia with the conviction, shared by many of his colleagues, that almost every disease was fundamentally a disease of the blood vessels, a condition of excessive tension or excitement in the vascular system that could and should be treated by removing blood until the tension was relieved. This theory, which Rush developed and elaborated upon throughout his career, and which he applied with extraordinary energy during the yellow fever epidemic that devastated Philadelphia in 1793, led him to recommend bloodletting on a scale that went well beyond what even most of his contemporaries were willing to accept, with some of his patients reportedly losing quantities of blood that would now be recognized as immediately life-threatening. During the 1793 epidemic, Rush bled patients repeatedly, sometimes removing what he estimated to be 80% of their blood volume over the course of a treatment, a practice that generated sharp criticism from some of his colleagues, even at the time, and that a subsequent historical analysis has suggested almost certainly accelerated the deaths of a significant number of the patients he was attempting to save. Rush himself remained convinced until his death in 1813 that his methods were correct, and his influence on American medical education through his writing and his teaching and his enormous personal authority as a figure of the revolutionary generation ensured that aggressive bloodletting remained a standard practice in American medicine for decades after his death. The patients who came to the hospitals and the private practices of Rush and his contemporaries and his students were entering a medical system that was, despite all of its confidence and all of its learning, operating in a kind of analytical darkness, unable to distinguish reliably between treatments that helped, treatments that were neutral, and treatments that harmed, because the epidemiological and statistical tools required to make those distinctions did not yet exist. The physician who saw a patient improve after bloodletting attributed the improvement to the bloodletting. The physician who saw a patient worsen or die after bloodletting attributed the worsening or death to the severity of the underlying illness. In both cases, the observation was filtered through a theory that could accommodate almost any outcome without requiring revision, which is precisely the quality that made the humoral theory so durable and so difficult to dislodge. It was not until the French physician Pierre Louis, working in the wards of the Hôpital de la Charité in Paris in the 1820s and 1830s, developed what he called the numerical method. Essentially, the systematic collection and analysis of patient outcome data, that it became possible to apply something resembling modern statistical thinking to the evaluation of bloodletting's effects. Louis published his findings on the treatment of pneumonia with bloodletting in 1828, and his data showed clearly that patients who were bled early in the course of the disease did not survive at higher rates than those who were bled later or not at all, and in some of his analyses, the bled patients appeared to fare worse than the unbled ones. This was not a revolutionary paper in the way that Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood had been revolutionary. It did not propose a new theory of disease or a new understanding of the body's mechanisms. It simply counted, carefully and methodically, how many people lived and how many died under different conditions of treatment, and it found that the treatment was not doing what its practitioners believed it was doing. The response of the medical establishment to Lewis's work was, as it often is in such cases, a mixture of interest and resistance, with some practitioners embracing the numerical method and its implications and others objecting to the reduction of the individual patient to a statistical unit and arguing that the clinical experience of the bedside physician could not and should not be replaced by tables of numbers. This debate between the authority of individual clinical experience and the authority of systematic empirical data is one that has recurred in various forms throughout the history of medicine and is not entirely resolved even today. Meanwhile, in the hospitals of Edinburgh and London and Vienna and Boston, the patients continued to be bled, though the frequencies and the volume of the bleedings were gradually declining through the middle decades of the 19th century. As the numerical method and the germ theory and the slow shift in medical education began to change the intellectual climate in which medicine was practiced, the germ theory of disease, developed and established through the work of Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany in the 1860s and 1870s, provided a new and ultimately far more accurate framework for understanding infectious illness, one that located the cause of disease not in the internal imbalance of the patient's body fluids, but in the external invasion of specific microscopic organisms, bacteria, and later viruses that could be identified, studied, and in time treated with interventions targeted specifically at them rather than at the supposed excess of blood or bile. Koch's identification of the tuberculosis bacillus in 1882 and his subsequent development of what he called Koch's postulates, the logical framework for establishing that a specific microorganism is the cause of a specific disease, represented a fundamental shift in the epistemology of medicine, a change in what it meant to understand an illness at all. Within this new framework, bloodletting was not simply a practice with uncertain benefits. It was a practice without any logical foundation, one directed at a cause of disease that the new science had demonstrated did not exist. And yet the decline of bloodletting was gradual rather than sudden, trailing off across the second half of the 19th century, rather than ending with a single dramatic repudiation. Because medical culture, like all culture, changes slowly and unevenly, with different practitioners in different places, moving at different speeds, away from old habits and toward new ones, and with patients who had been taught to expect and even to request the lancet, sometimes having to be persuaded that the bleeding bowl was no longer necessary. It is deeply sorrowful to contemplate how many people were carried away in that long twilight of the practice. In the decades between Lewis's numerical method and the final fading of bloodletting from mainstream medical practice, in that extended period when the evidence was accumulating, and the theory was shifting, and the lancets were still being sharpened in the back rooms of barbershops and the sick rooms of the middling classes. These were not people who lived so long ago that their lives feel like abstraction, the inhabitants of the Roman Empire or the courts of medieval Europe. Many of them lived in the same century as the Industrial Age, in cities with gaslit streets and telegraph offices and railway stations, in a world that was in many ways recognizably modern, and they came to their physicians trusting in the system of knowledge and care that those physicians represented, and some of them were harmed by that trust. This is not cause for cynicism about medicine or about the physicians of the past. It is cause, perhaps, for a quiet and persisting humility, a recognition that the medicine of any era reflects not only what is known, but also what is not yet known, and that the patients of every generation place themselves in the hands of practitioners who are doing their best within the limits of what their time and their training have made available to them. The past is very patient. It does not demand anything of us, except that we pay attention to it, softly and without urgency, the way we are paying attention to it now. And so we move, gradually, from the world of the lancet and the bleeding bowl into a different era, one no less confident in its treatments and no less capable of the peculiar kind of harm that confident wrongness produces in medicine. The 19th century, which had finally begun to dismantle the humoral theory, was at the same time building new edifices of medical practice that would require the 20th century to dismantle. In turn, new certainties that would become new cautionary tales, new procedures performed with new conviction by new generations of sincere and dedicated practitioners. Among these new certainties, one of the most consequential and one of the most sorrowful was a theory about the nature of cancer and about the proper surgical response to it. A theory that would determine the treatment of breast cancer in the United States and much of the Western world for the better part of a century. And that would leave its mark on the bodies of hundreds of thousands of women before the weight of evidence finally turned against it. This was the theory of William Stewart Halsted. William Stewart Halsted was born in New York City in 1852, and he was educated at Yale and at the College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York, and he completed his surgical training in Europe in the late 1870s and early 1880s, at a time when European surgery was undergoing a profound transformation under the influence of Joseph Lister's antiseptic technique, which had dramatically reduced the rate of post-operative infection by applying carbolic acid to wounds and instruments and dressings, and thereby creating conditions in which surgical procedures could be performed with a survival rate that made complex operations not merely possible, but routine. Halsted returned to the United States with European training and European methods and a commanding personal authority that would make him one of the most influential figures in the history of American surgery. And in 1894, he published the paper that would define his legacy, describing the operation that came to bear his name, the radical mastectomy for breast cancer. The operation Halsted described removed not only the affected breast, but both of the chest wall muscles on the same side, the pectoralis major and the pectoralis minor, as well as the lymph nodes in the armpit, in some cases extending to the removal of additional tissue from the chest wall and the neck. This was an operation of extraordinary extent, and it left the women who underwent it with a chest wall that was concave rather than flat, with limited mobility in the arm on the affected side, with a tendency toward the chronic swelling of the arm called lymphedema that could persist for the rest of their lives, with scarring that was extensive and visible even through clothing. Halsted justified this radical approach on the basis of his theory of how breast cancer spread, which held that the disease traveled outward from its point of origin along anatomical pathways in a predictable and essentially local progression, and that if the surgeon removed enough tissue around the original tumor, removing everything that the cancers might have touched or might touch, then the cancer could be entirely excised and the patient cured. The theory was elegant in the way that surgical theories often are, with a clear logic that made immediate sense to anyone trained in the anatomical tradition in which Halsted had been educated, and it was advanced by a man of such prestige and such influence that it was adopted with remarkable speed and remarkable completeness by the American surgical community. Halsted trained the surgeons who trained the surgeons who trained the surgeons of 20th century America, and the radical mastectomy spread through American hospitals like a teaching, passed from one generation to the next as the correct and proper and thoroughly established standard of care for a disease that struck women with a regularity that made it one of the most feared diagnoses a physician could deliver. Women who presented with breast cancer, whether the tumor was small or large, whether the disease appeared to be localized or not, were almost universally subject to the radical mastectomy as the primary surgical response, because this was what the evidence of the day supported, and the evidence of the day was the authority of Halsted and his successors. And the authority of Halsted was the authority of a man who had built modern American surgery with his own hands, and who had done so in ways that genuinely improved outcomes in many areas of surgical practice. The tragedy of the radical mastectomy was not that it was performed by bad surgeons or recommended by indifferent physicians. The tragedy was that it was performed by the best surgeons, recommended by the most dedicated physicians, and that its dominance in American medical practice persisted for decades, after evidence began to accumulate, suggesting that less extensive surgery achieved comparable survival rates. As early as the 1940s, researchers in Europe were publishing results suggesting that simpler operations, removing the breast but not the chest muscles, produced outcomes in breast cancer patients that were at least as good as those produced by the radical mastectomy, and the Cleveland Clinic surgeon, George Barney Cryle Jr., published a public challenge to the Halsted operation in 1955 that brought the debate into the open. But the Halsted mastectomy did not yield easily, and the reasons for its persistence in the face of contrary evidence offer a lesson in the sociology of medicine that is as important as any purely clinical finding. The operation had become embedded in the identity of American surgery. It was associated with the training programs and the teaching hospitals that had formed the professional identities of the men who performed it. It was supported by the cancer charity apparatus that had developed in the mid-20th century around a military metaphor of heroic intervention against an enemy disease, a metaphor that made aggressive surgery feel not only medically but morally correct, the courageous and manly response to the cowardly enemy of cancer. And it was performed on women by men in an era when the voices of patients in the determination of their own treatment carried far less institutional weight than they would come to carry in the women's health movement of the late 1960s and 1970s. It was not until the randomized clinical trials of Bernard Fisher, published through the National Surgical Adjuvant Breast and Bowel Project in the 1970s and 1980s, demonstrated with the statistical power of large controlled studies that less extensive surgery achieved equivalent survival outcomes, that the radical mastectomy finally began to give way, that the last bastions of Halsted surgery in the great American teaching hospitals laid down their instruments and acknowledged, quietly and without fanfare, that the standard of care for a century had been more extensive, more disfiguring, and more damaging to quality of life than it needed to be. The rooms in which all of this happened, the operating theatres and the surgical wards and the consulting rooms where physicians told their women patients what would be done, were rooms lit with electric light. By the time the debate reached its resolution, rooms equipped with modern instruments and modern anesthesia and the full apparatus of 20th century hospital medicine, which makes the persistence of the error more, not less, remarkable, and more, not less, instructive as a lesson in how medicine works and how it fails to work. The women who underwent radical mastectomies in the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s were not patients of the ancient world, not subjects of an era without science or without the tools to evaluate medical claims. They were patients in the modern era, treated in institutions that prided themselves on their scientific credentials, and the treatment they received was guided not by ancient superstition, but by the accumulated authority of the best surgical training their era had produced. And that authority was wrong, not about everything, not even about most things, but about this one operation, this one theory of cancer's spread, and the appropriate surgical response to it. And the wrongness played out across decades and across hundreds of thousands of bodies, adding up to a total of unnecessary suffering that is difficult to calculate and impossible to look at steadily without feeling something like grief. It is worth letting that grief rest quietly here for a moment, in the way that all difficult things are easier to bear when they are given a moment of stillness before being carried forward. The women who bore the physical marks of radical mastectomies, who lived with concave chest walls and lymphodematous arms, and the lifelong physical evidence of an operation that was larger than it needed to be, are part of the long and quietly sorrowful history we are tracing together tonight. They are in the company of the patients bled by Rush in the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, and the patients poisoned by mercury in the syphilis wards of early modern Europe, and the patients of George Washington's era, who died of diseases that the available medicine could not cure, and the available treatments sometimes hastened. They are all part of the same story, the story of medicine's relationship with its own uncertainty, and of the ways in which that uncertainty, when it is not acknowledged and not examined, and not subjected to the careful scrutiny of the numerical method and the controlled trial, can produce harm on a scale that the individual acts of care that compose it do not prepare us to expect. The candle burns a little lower, the night is a little quieter, and there is more of this story still to come. The decade of the 1950s, which saw the radical mastectomy still firmly in place as the standard surgical response to breast cancer and mercury, still occasionally encountered in certain medical preparations, though well past its peak, also brought a new chapter in the history of medical harm, one that unfolded not in the operating theatre, but in the much quieter and apparently more benign domain of the pharmaceutical tablet, and one that would result in a tragedy so broad and so visible and so undeniably attributable to a specific medical decision that it would change forever the regulatory framework governing how new drugs were tested and approved in the Western world. This was the thalidomide tragedy, and it began in Germany in 1957, when a pharmaceutical company called Chemie Grünenthal introduced to the West German market a new sedative and anti-nausea medication under the trade name Contagon, a drug that had been developed in the company's laboratories and that its manufacturers promoted as safe, mild, and particularly suitable for use in pregnant women suffering from the nausea and vomiting of early pregnancy, which the medical literature of the era sometimes called morning sickness. The drug spread rapidly across Europe and into other markets around the world, sold under various trade names in over 40 countries, and it was embraced with enthusiasm by the physicians who prescribed it, because it appeared to be genuinely effective against the nausea it was marketed to treat, and because its manufacturers assured them, and the regulatory agencies of their respective countries, that it had been thoroughly tested and found to be safe. Thalidomide worked through mechanisms that the pharmacology of the late 1950s was not fully equipped to understand, and its safety profile in adult users was, indeed, reasonably reassuring, since the drug did not cause immediate obvious harm in the men and women who took it for insomnia, or anxiety, or morning sickness, and since the effects that would eventually make it notorious were of a kind that required months to become apparent, and that appeared not in the people taking the drug but in their children. The children were born with malformations of the limbs, a condition called phocomelia, in which the long bones of the arms and legs fail to develop properly, leaving the hands and feet attached directly to the torso with little or no intervening limb structure, a presentation that was so rare before the thalidomide era that many physicians who encountered it in the late 1950s and early 1960s had never seen it before in their careers. The connection between the drug and the malformations was not immediately obvious, partly because the affected children were geographically dispersed across many countries and many individual medical practices, and partly because the drug's terogenic effect was limited to a specific and narrow window of fetal development, roughly between the 20th and 36th day after conception, which fell within the period when many women did not yet know they were pregnant or had only just confirmed the pregnancy. making it difficult to establish retrospectively whether the medication had been taken at the critical time. It was the German physician Widukind Lenz who first gathered systematic evidence of the connection, presenting his findings to the German Medical Association in November 1961 and contacting the drug's manufacturer. And it was Francis Oldham Kelsey, a pharmacologist and physician working as a reviewer at the United States Food and Drug Administration, who had declined to approve thalidomide for sale in the United States, on the grounds that the safety data submitted by the manufacturer was inadequate, a decision that spared the American population from the worst of the tragedy, though not entirely, since some thalidomide had been distributed in the United States as part of clinical trials. By the time the drug was withdrawn from the market in most countries in November and December of 1961, more than 10,000 children in over 20 countries had been born with thalidomide-related malformations, and an unknown additional number of pregnancies had ended in miscarriage as a result of the drug's interference with fetal development. The thalidomide tragedy, like the history of bloodletting and the history of mercury and the history of the radical mastectomy, is not a story about evil, though there were moments in its unfolding when the slow response of certain pharmaceutical executives and regulatory bodies to accumulating evidence of harm shades into something harder to excuse than mere ignorance. It is, at its center, a story about the gap between what was tested and what was not tested, about the way in which a drug that appeared safe in the population of adults who took it could cause devastating harm in the population of developing embryos who were never part of the original safety evaluation, because the science of teratology, the study of how substances affect fetal development, was not in 1957 a well-developed field, and the regulatory requirements of the era did not routinely mandate testing of new drugs in pregnant animals before their approval for use in pregnant humans. Frances Kell's caution, her insistence that the manufacturers submit more complete data before she would approve the drug for the American market, was not the result of any special insight into thalidomide's teratogenic mechanism. It was the result of a general scientific caution, a concern about the adequacy of the submitted evidence that happened in this case to be entirely correct. She was awarded the Federal Civilian Service Award by President John F. Kennedy in 1962, and her work became a touchstone in the campaign for stronger drug regulation that led to the Kefauver-Harris Amendment to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in the same year, an amendment that substantially strengthened the requirements for demonstrating both the safety and the efficacy of new drugs before their approval, and that made the United States regulatory framework one of the most rigorous in the world for the decades that followed. The thalidomide tragedy, in other words, changed medicine, not immediately and not completely, but in ways that matter and that persist, by making visible with terrible clarity the cost of insufficient scrutiny, the price paid by the bodies of the most vulnerable, when the system designed to protect them moves too slowly or asks too few questions. It is a remarkable thing to consider, lying here in the quiet of the night. How many of the protections that govern modern medicine, the requirements for clinical trials and safety testing, and transparent disclosure of results, the regulatory frameworks that must be satisfied before a drug or a device can be offered to patients, the ethical guidelines that govern experimentation on human subjects. How many of these protections were built not in anticipation of harm, but in response to it, constructed in the wake of specific tragedies that revealed specific failures in the systems that had existed before? The modern clinical trial, with its randomized assignment of patients to treatment or control groups, and its statistical analysis of outcomes, was not invented in the abstract by scientists thinking carefully about epistemology, though the epistemological foundations for it were laid by figures like Pierre Louis and James Lind in earlier centuries. It was developed and institutionalized in the mid-20th century, in part because the medical world had experienced too many instances of treatments that seemed to work but didn't, or seemed safe but weren't, and had come to understand, through those costly experiences, that the evidence required to support a medical claim needed to be of a kind that the tradition of clinical experience could not provide. The Declaration of Helsinki, the international ethical framework governing medical research involving human subjects, was adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, in the same decade as the thalidomide response, and in the shadow of the revelations about what had been done to research subjects in the Second World War, reflecting a growing understanding that the relationship between the medical researcher and the research subject required explicit ethical governance rather than simply the good intentions of individual practitioners. These frameworks are imperfect, and they have their own histories of failure and revision, but they represent a genuine effort to build the lessons of the past into the structure of the present, to make the sorrowful catalogue of medical harm that history has accumulated into something useful, something that serves the living rather than merely commemorating the dead. And yet it is in the nature of medical harm that it tends to stay ahead of the frameworks designed to prevent it, finding new forms as old ones are addressed, appearing in domains that the regulations of the previous era were not designed to cover. The history of the lobotomy, which was being performed throughout the same decades that thalidomide was spreading across European pharmacies, and radical mastectomies were being performed in American operating rooms, offers yet another example of a treatment that achieved extraordinary acceptance on the basis of evidence that was inadequate by any rigorous standard, and that caused harm on a scale that became fully apparent only as the decades passed and the patients who had undergone the procedure aged, and their outcomes could be assessed with something approaching the objectivity of distance. The lobotomy, in its transorbital form, as popularized by the American neurologist Walter Freeman, was performed by inserting a thin instrument resembling an ice pick through the bony socket of the eye and into the frontal lobe of the brain, and then moving the instrument to sever the nerve fibers connecting the frontal lobe to the deeper structures of the brain, thereby interrupting the neural circuits that Freeman and others believed were responsible for the severe psychological suffering of patients with schizophrenia, severe depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and a range of other conditions that the psychiatry of the era had difficulty treating by any other means. Freeman himself performed more than 3,000 such procedures between 1936 and 1967, often traveling in a vehicle he called the Lobotomobile, bringing his surgical technique to hospitals and institutions across the United States that lacked a trained neurosurgeon on staff, demonstrating the procedure with a showman's confidence and a genuine belief in its therapeutic power that never entirely left him, even as evidence of its failures and its harms accumulated around him. The story of the lobotomy and of Walter Freeman's role in its history is long enough and complicated enough to deserve more time than we can give it in this chapter, but the essential shape of it is clear enough to trace in the quiet of this night. Freeman believed, sincerely and with a passion that coloured everything he did, that the psychiatric suffering of his patients could be relieved by a physical intervention in the brain. And in this belief, he was ahead of his time in some respects, anticipating the biological turn in psychiatry that would come to dominate the field in the latter decades of the 20th century. But the intervention he chose was crude and irreversible, performed without the imaging technology or the physiological understanding that would be required to make brain surgery a reliable and targeted intervention, rather than a blunt alteration of the brain's overall function, and the results it produced were not the results that Freeman's published accounts suggested. Patients who had been dramatically agitated or suffering became, in many cases, quieter, more manageable, easier to care for in the institutional settings where many of them lived. And Freeman interpreted this quieting as therapeutic success, as evidence that the procedure had relieved suffering. But the patients themselves and the relatives who watched them often saw this to something different. A flattening of personality and emotion, a loss of the very qualities that had made the person recognizable as themselves. A change that was not healing but erasure. Some patients deteriorated severely after the procedure. Some died as a direct result of complications, with Freeman acknowledging a mortality rate that shifted over the years, but that his critics argued he systematically underreported. And the antipsychotic medications that became available beginning in the mid-1950s, starting with chlorpromazine, which was introduced in France in 1952 and in the United States in 1954, offered a pharmacological alternative to psychosurgery that achieved symptom relief without the permanence and the physical risks of the ice pick through the eye socket, and the availability of that alternative began to reduce the appeal of the lobotomy among the psychiatric and neurological communities with a speed that the sheer weight of evidence for the procedure's harms had not, on its own, been able to achieve. The decline of the lobotomy was not simply the result of new evidence. It was the result of new alternatives, new social currents in the understanding of mental illness and the rights of patients, and a growing unease in the broader culture about the morality of altering personality by surgical means, an unease reflected in the literature and film of the era. Most powerfully, in Ken Kesey's 1962 novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which placed the lobotomy at the center of a cultural meditation on power, conformity, and the definition of sanity that resonated far beyond the specific historical context that produced it. By the time Freeman performed his last lobotomy in 1967 on a patient who died from a cerebral hemorrhage following the procedure, the practice was already deeply marginal in mainstream psychiatry, associated in the public mind with the most troubling aspects of institutional medicine and the most significant failures of the humanitarian impulse that had, at its best, animated the entire project of modern medicine from the beginning. The lobotomy had arrived in the world with a Nobel Prize, awarded to the Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz in 1949 for his role in developing the procedure, a recognition that now stands as one of the more quietly embarrassing decisions in the history of that prize. A reminder that the highest formal recognition that the scientific world can bestow is not a guarantee of lasting validity, and that the distance between celebrated innovation and cautionary tale can be, in medicine as in other fields, shorter than the celebrations suggest. And so Chapter 6 ends as it must end, not with a resolution, but with a transition, the lobotomy fading into the institutional shadows as a new era of medical harm was already assembling itself in the laboratories and the consulting rooms of the mid-20th century, ready to take its place in this long and quietly sorrowful catalogue. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a hospital ward in the deepest hours of the night, when the day shift has long since gone home, and the night nurses move between beds with the unhurried efficiency of people who have learned to do their work without disturbing the sleep of those around them. And in that silence, which is not quite complete, but only a softening of the ordinary sounds of the waking world, it is possible to feel the weight of all the history that has passed through rooms like these, the accumulated years of hope and error and careful intention that have made the practice of medicine what it is. We have come a long way together now, through the bleeding bowls of antiquity and the mercury baths of the syphilis centuries and the radical mastectomies of Halstead and the thalidomide dispensaries of the late 1950s and the lobotomy theatres of Walter Freeman. And in each of these places, we have found the same essential story wearing different clothes. The story of well-meaning practitioners working at the edge of what their era knew, and of the patients who trusted them, and of the gap between intention and outcome that sometimes, and more often than anyone involved, would wish to acknowledge, widened into tragedy. The 7th chapter of our journey takes us into a domain that is in some ways more intimate and more persistent than any we have visited so far. A domain not of dramatic surgical procedures or spectacular pharmaceutical failures, but of the quiet, ordinary, everyday practice of prescribing medicine for conditions that respond to treatment in ways that the prescribing physician cannot always predict or control. This is the domain of what medical historians and pharmacologists call iatrogenic harm, from the Greek iatros, meaning physician, and genesis, meaning origin. The harm that originates with the healer rather than with the disease, and it is a domain so vast and so variously populated with examples that we could spend many more hours here than we will, tracing its contours through the centuries and across the full breadth of the medical enterprise. Among the most instructive examples of iatrogenic harm in the history of modern medicines is the story of the opioid treatments that were applied to pain and suffering across much of the 19th century with a confidence and a liberality that the 20th century would come to regard with deep ambivalence, and the 21st century with something closer to horror. The opiates, derived from the poppy plant Papaver somniferum, and known in one form or another since ancient times, had been used as painkillers and sedatives and relaxants across many cultures for millennia, and their power to relieve suffering was genuine and undeniable, and genuinely valued in a world where surgery was performed without reliable anesthesia, and where the pain of injury and illness was a constant and often overwhelming feature of ordinary life. Laudanum, which was a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, had been prescribed by physicians since the 16th century, when Paracelsus, that same restless Swiss-German iconoclast who had advocated for mercury in the treatment of syphilis, first described the preparation and praised its effects. By the 19th century, laudanum was so widely prescribed and so freely available in the pharmacies and druggists' shops of Europe and North America that it was, in the most literal sense, a household product, consumed in enormous quantities for conditions ranging from severe pain to mild anxiety, to the sleeplessness of infants, whose parents and caregivers dosed them with preparations containing opium under trade names like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which was sold openly in the United States and Britain from the 1840s onward, and which contained, per dose, a quantity of morphine sufficient to cause measurable physiological dependence with regular use. The morphine that was isolated from opium in 1804 by the German chemist Friedrich Serturner, was hailed as a medical advance of the first order, a purified and more reliable form of the active principle of opium that could be measured and standardized in ways that the crude tincture could not, and the development of the hypodermic syringe in the 1840s and 1850s made it possible to deliver morphine directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the digestive system and producing an effect that was faster and more powerful and more consistent than anything previously available. The Civil War in the United States, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, and produced casualties of a scale and a character that overwhelmed the medical systems of both sides, created conditions in which morphine was administered by military surgeons in quantities that would have been unimaginable in the peacetimes medicine of the previous decade. And the men who came back from that war, carrying in their bodies both their wounds and their dependence on the morphine that had been used to treat those wounds, represented the first large-scale encounter of American medicine with what would come to be understood as opioid addiction, though the understanding of that condition was limited and the medical response to it inadequate. The veterans who could not stop using morphine were described in the medical literature of the era with a terminology that reflected the moral and social frameworks of the time more than any physiological understanding of dependence, described as having developed a habit or a vice, with the implication that the condition was as much a failure of character as a consequence of treatment. This framing had consequences that persisted well into the 20th century, shaping the social and legal responses to opioid dependence in ways that prioritized punishment over treatment, and that made it harder, rather than easier, for people struggling with dependence to receive the medical help that might have addressed the physiological roots of their condition. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry of the late 19th century continued to innovate in the opiate family, and in 1898, the Bayer Company, the same German pharmaceutical company that had introduced aspirin to the world in the previous year, brought to market a new semi-synthetic opioid derived from morphine, marketed under the trade name Heroin and promoted in Bayer's advertising as a non-addictive substitute for morphine, a cough suppressant suitable for use in children, and a treatment for morphine dependence itself, a claim that combined all the elements of medical optimism and pharmaceutical ambition that make certain chapters of the history of medicine particularly instructive to revisit from the comfortable distance of more than a century. The claim that heroin was non-addictive was not made cynically, or at least there is no historical evidence that compels us to conclude that it was, though the pressure on pharmaceutical manufacturers to present their products favorably to physicians and consumers is a constant feature of the commercial landscape in which those products exist in the 19th century, as in every subsequent one. The pharmacologists who tested heroin in Bayer's laboratories found that it produced the pain-relieving and cough-suppressing effects they were looking for without some of the more immediately noticeable side effects of morphine, and they interpreted this relative tolerability in the short term as evidence of a broader safety profile that the longer-term evidence did not support. The dependence that heroin produced was, if anything, more severe and more difficult to address than the dependence associated with morphine, partly because of the speed with which the drug crossed the blood-brain barrier and produced its characteristic euphoric effect, and partly because of the intensity of the withdrawal syndrome that followed its discontinuation. But these properties were not apparent in the short-term laboratory tests or the brief clinical trials that Bayer had conducted before bringing the drug to market, because the testing period was not long enough to reveal them. Heroin was withdrawn from the American medical market by 1913, and its manufacture and import were made illegal in the United States by 1924. But by that time, it had already established itself in the underground economy as the drug of choice for a population of dependent users whose dependence had in many cases begun with a physician's prescription or a pharmacist's recommendation, and whose suffering was now compounded by the legal and social consequences of a dependence that had originated in a medical encounter. It is worth noting, in this quiet consideration of the opioid history, that the story did not end in 1924 or even in the middle decades of the 20th century, when heroin was well established as a street drug, and the opiates had largely receded from mainstream medical prescribing, replaced by the new pharmacological families of the mid-century, the barbiturates and the benzodiazepines, and eventually the synthetic analgesics. The story of opioid harm in medicine has a second, and in some ways even more consequential chapter that begins in the 1990s in the United States, when a new generation of extended-release opioid formulations, marketed with assurances about their safety profile and their low potential for abuse, that bore a disturbing family resemblance to the claims made about heroin a century before, were introduced into the American medical system and prescribed with a liberality that the evidence available at the time of introduction did not justify. The extended release oxycodone preparation, marketed under the brand name OxyContin, was approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 1995 and promoted by its manufacturer, Purdue Pharma, through a marketing campaign that included claims about the drug's low addiction potential and its suitability for a wide range of pain conditions. Claims that the manufacturer's own internal documents would later be shown to have been made without adequate evidential support. The consequences of this prescribing expansion have been documented in the public health literature of the early 21st century with a specificity and a scale that make them among the most thoroughly characterized episodes of iatrogenic harm in the history of modern medicine, with estimates suggesting that opioid overdoses, including both prescription opioids and the illicit drugs to which many prescription-dependent individuals transitioned, caused several 100,000 deaths in the United States in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. This number, which is very large and very real, is arrived at here not to create alarm or urgency, since this is, as always, a gentle and unhurried telling, but simply because the scale of it is part of the truth, and the truth, even when it is large and sorrowful, deserves to be spoken quietly and accurately in the night. The physicians who prescribed opioids in large quantities in the late 1990s and early 2000s were working within a medical culture that had shifted significantly in the previous decade toward a greater emphasis on the treatment of pain, a shift that was in many ways a genuine ethical improvement over the previous culture, which had in some instances been excessively reluctant to provide adequate pain relief to patients who needed it. The American Pain Society introduced the concept of pain as the 5th vital sign in 1995. The same year, OxyContin was approved, and the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations adopted standards requiring hospitals to assess and manage pain more aggressively beginning in 2001, creating an institutional environment in which the undertreatment of pain was a measurable failure, and the prescription of powerful analgesics could feel not merely justified, but obligatory. This context does not excuse the specific acts of deception and omission that characterized Purdue Pharma's marketing campaign, which ultimately resulted in the company pleading guilty to federal criminal charges in both 2007 and 2020, and agreeing to settlements worth billions of dollars. But it does complicate the simple narrative of villainous pharmaceutical manufacturers and passive medical victims by showing that the prescribing physicians who wrote the prescriptions were operating within a system that gave them strong signals from their professional associations and their hospital administrators and their patients and their pharmaceutical representatives. That aggressive pain management with opioids was the compassionate and medically correct approach. The history of iatrogenic harm is rarely a simple story of knowable evil. It is usually, and more instructively, a story of systemic failures, of incentive structures and information asymmetries, and professional cultures that allow harm to accumulate in ways that no individual actor operating within the logic of their own position fully perceives or intends. During this same broad period of the 20th and early 21st centuries, in parallel with the opioid story, and drawing on some of the same themes of pharmaceutical optimism and inadequate long-term testing, another class of medications was making its way into the daily lives of millions of patients with a safety profile that appeared reassuring in the short term, and that revealed its complexities and its harms only as the years and then the decades of continuous use accumulated their evidence. These were the benzodiazepines, the class of anti-anxiety and sleep medications that includes diazepam, sold under the brand name Valium, and chlordiazepoxide, sold under the name Librium, and a large family of related compounds that have been among the most widely prescribed medications in the history of modern pharmacology. Librium was introduced in 1960, Valium in 1963, and the pharmaceutical industry that brought them to market promoted them as safe alternatives to the barbiturates that had been the primary pharmaceutical treatment for anxiety and insomnia in the preceding decades, and which had shown, as the clinical experience of the 1950s accumulated, a lethal potential in overdose that made them genuinely dangerous medications, particularly in a population already struggling with conditions that included suicidal ideation. The benzodiazepines appeared, by comparison, to be much safer, with a large therapeutic window that made accidental overdose less immediately dangerous, and they were prescribed with considerable enthusiasm by the physicians and psychiatrists of the 1960s and 1970s. Valium becoming by the early 1970s one of the most prescribed drugs in the United States, and in many Western European countries, with estimates suggesting that by the mid-1970s, somewhere between 10 and 15% of adults in the United States were taking benzodiazepines at some point in any given year. The problem that emerged with the benzodiazepines over the following decades was not that they were ineffective, since they were genuinely effective at reducing anxiety and promoting sleep in the short term, nor was it primarily that they were acutely dangerous in the way that the barbiturates had been, though benzodiazepines taken in combination with alcohol or other central nervous system depressants carried significant risks. The problem was the dependence that developed with regular use, a physiological adaptation of the brain to the continued presence of the drug that produced, upon discontinuation, a withdrawal syndrome that could be prolonged and deeply uncomfortable, and that in some patients with histories of very heavy long-term use could include severe neurological effects. The psychiatrist and pharmacologist Heather Ashton, working at the University of Newcastle in England and treating patients with benzodiazepine dependence through her clinic from 1982 onward, documented the withdrawal syndrome with a systematic thoroughness that produced what became known as the Ashton Manual, a guide to tapering benzodiazepine use, that has been used by patients and physicians around the world. And that was published online in 2002, filling a gap in the clinical literature that the mainstream medical community was slow to address. Ashton's work and the patient testimony that it drew upon and supported painted a picture of benzodiazepine dependence that was both more widespread and more difficult to treat than the pharmaceutical companies that had introduced these drugs had suggested. And it raised questions about the long-term neurological effects of chronic benzodiazepine use, including the possibility of lasting cognitive impairment that some research suggested persisted even after successful discontinuation of the drug. The pattern that the benzodiazepine story traces is by now a familiar one in this long nocturnal catalogue: the introduction of a new pharmaceutical agent with a safety profile that appears adequate in the short term, the rapid and widespread adoption of the new agent by physicians who are genuinely trying to help their patients, the slow accumulation of evidence of harms that only become apparent with long-term use, and the delayed and sometimes inadequate response of the medical and regulatory systems to that accumulating evidence. This pattern does not mean that pharmaceutical innovation is bad, or that new drugs should be treated with uniform suspicion, or that the patients who were helped by benzodiazepines or by opioids or by any other medication whose history includes episodes of harm were wrong to accept them. It means that the history of medicine contains, as a persistent and instructive thread, the reminder that the testing of a new treatment is never complete at the moment of its introduction, that the evidence available at approval is necessarily limited compared to the evidence that will eventually accumulate across decades of real-world use in millions of patients, and that the humility this recognition demands is not a counsel of therapeutic nihilism, but rather a counsel of ongoing vigilance, of continued questioning, of the willingness to revise the practices of today in the light of the evidence of tomorrow. The night is very still now. The sounds of the waking world have receded almost entirely, and there is something restful, perhaps, in this long accounting of the past, in the recognition that the errors we are tracing were not unique to any one era or any one kind of practitioner, but were the common condition of medicine in all its historical forms, which means that what we are really tracing is not a series of failures, but a series of attempts, each imperfect and each instructive, each leaving behind some small residue of knowledge that the next generation could use to do a little better. Over the next century, following the introduction of germ theory and the development of the first genuinely targeted antimicrobial agents, the history of medical harm took on new dimensions that were not simply continuations of the old story of treatments applied without adequate understanding of their effects. The new dimension was the dimension of surgical overtreatment, the tendency to apply surgical intervention on a scale, and with a confidence that sometimes exceeded what the evidence for its benefit could support, and that sometimes produced harms not only through the specific procedures performed, but through the cumulative effects of the surgical culture that normalized aggressive intervention as the default response to a wide range of medical conditions. This tendency was not unique to any single specialty or any single era of the 20th century, but it found some of its clearest expressions in the history of the treatment of peptic ulcer disease, of the surgical response to chronic tonsillitis, and of the approach to back pain and spinal conditions that characterized American orthopedic and neurosurgical practice through much of the latter half of the 20th century. The tonsillectomy, which is the surgical removal of the tonsils, was performed in the United States at rates that reached into the millions of procedures annually during the 1950s and 1960s on the basis of a clinical rationale that held that chronically enlarged or infected tonsils were a source of persistent infection and systemic illness, and that their removal would produce substantial health benefits in the children who were the primary recipients of the procedure. The evidence for this rationale was, as subsequent systematic reviews would establish, considerably weaker than the surgical culture of the era had assumed, and the rates of tonsillectomy in the United States declined substantially. After studies in the 1970s and 1980s demonstrated that most children with recurrent throat infections did not benefit substantially from surgery over watchful waiting, and that the procedure carried its own risks of complications, including the anesthetic risks that attend any surgery in a young child, that were not justified by the limited evidence for benefit in most cases. The surgical treatment of back pain, which involved procedures ranging from spinal fusion to laminectomy to the implantation of various mechanical devices intended to stabilize the spine and relieve pressure on the nerve roots, whose compression was believed to cause the chronic pain, presents a particularly instructive case study in the complexities of surgical evidence and the difficulties of measuring the benefit of invasive interventions in conditions where the natural history is variable and the placebo response is substantial. Spinal fusion surgery, in which two or more vertebrae are permanently joined together using bone grafts or metal hardware or both, was performed at rates in the United States that grew dramatically through the 1990s and 2000s, reaching several 100,000 procedures annually by the early 2000s, and representing a substantial proportion of the total cost of musculoskeletal care in the American healthcare system. The evidence supporting the benefit of spinal fusion over conservative management for most of the conditions for which it was performed was, and to a considerable extent remains, inconsistent and contested with well-designed randomized trials in several diagnostic categories showing little or no advantage of surgical fusion over physical therapy and rehabilitation in terms of long-term functional outcomes, while other studies and large registries of surgical outcomes suggested benefit in more carefully selected patient populations. The difficulty of interpreting this evidence is compounded by the genuine heterogeneity of the conditions, labeled as requiring spinal fusion, the powerful financial incentives that exist for hospitals and surgical practices to perform high volumes of procedures that carry substantial reimbursement, and the well-documented phenomenon of regional variation in surgical rates that has been extensively studied by the researchers of the Dartmouth Atlas of Healthcare, and that reveals, across the United States, differences in the rates of many surgical procedures that cannot be explained by differences in the prevalence of disease, but only by differences in the local medical culture and the practice preferences of the surgeons who work in particular communities. It is in this landscape of variation and uncertainty and financial incentive that the story of surgical overtreatment becomes most difficult to summarize without oversimplification. because the line between appropriate and excessive surgical intervention is not always clear, and the same procedure that represents overtreatment in one patient may be genuinely therapeutic in another. And the physician trying to draw that line in the consulting room with a specific patient in pain in front of them and a specific set of imaging, findings, and a specific history of conservative treatment that has or has not been tried is making a judgment that cannot always be reduced to the application of a statistical finding from a clinical trial to an individual case. The history of surgical overtreatment, in other words, does not have villains as clearly defined as Chemie Grunenthal marketing thalidomide to pregnant women, or even Halstead imposing the radical mastectomy on a century of breast cancer patients on the basis of a theory he never subjected to adequate empirical test. It has instead a more diffuse kind of harm, distributed across a large number of individual decisions made in good faith, within a system that was not well designed to produce optimal outcomes. And that understanding of it, though less narratively satisfying than the cleaner stories, is probably closer to the truth of how medical harm most commonly occurs in the modern era. The warmth of the night has settled fully around us now, and we have been moving together through these histories for long enough that the individual chapters of the story are beginning to blend into something larger, something more like a continuous thread than a series of separate episodes. And it is worth pausing here, at the midpoint of our catalogue, to notice what that thread has been, what quality persists across all of these otherwise very different stories. The thread is not malice. The thread is not incompetence, at least not primarily. The thread is something subtler, and in some ways more instructive, which is the tendency of medical knowledge at any given moment to exceed the humility of the practitioners who deploy it, the tendency of confidence to run ahead of evidence, of certainty to colonize territory that uncertainty had not yet finished mapping. This tendency is not unique to medicine, and it is not unique to any particular era of medical history. It is, if anything, a deeply human tendency, the same tendency that leads us to commit to explanations before we have fully examined all the evidence, to trust the patterns we have already learned more than the anomalies that might complicate them, to see in the outcome of our treatments the confirmation of our theories rather than the noise of a complex system responding in ways our theories cannot fully predict. And in the history of medicine, this tendency, which is in its origins simply the tendency to try to help and to believe that one's help is helping, has produced both great achievements and great harms, sometimes in the same lifetime, sometimes through the same hands, sometimes with the same patients who were spared one kind of suffering, only to encounter another kind that the available medicine was not yet wise enough to prevent. Let your breathing slow a little more now, if you can, and let the weight of these centuries rest lightly on you, not as a burden, but as a kind of company, the quiet company of all the people who have lived and suffered and been cared for, and sometimes harmed by the imperfect art of healing across the long span of human history. They are very far away, most of them, separated from us by centuries and by the vast transformations of the world they lived in, and the world we live in, and yet in this one dimension of their experience, the dimension of placing their trust in another person's knowledge, and hoping that the knowledge is sufficient to the need, they are not so different from us, not so distant that their stories fail to touch something familiar and recognizable in the human experience of illness and care. The physician who stands at the bedside, in any century and in any place, is a person doing their best with what they know. and the patient who lies in the bed is a person hoping that the best will be enough. And this scene, repeated across all of human history, in every language and every climate and every form of healing that human cultures have developed, is the fundamental scene that all of these chapters are really about. It is not a comfortable scene when examined closely, but it is a deeply human one. And in the long quiet of the night, it is possible to hold it with something like compassion for the healers and the healed alike, for the imperfect knowledge and the genuine care and the slow progress towards something better. Meanwhile, as we have been following these threads through the history of pharmaceutical harm and surgical overtreatment, another story has been unfolding in the background of our narrative, one that takes place not in the operating theatre or the pharmacy, but in the broader arena of public health practice and the responses of governments and institutions to disease at the population level. And this story contains its own deeply instructive examples of well-meaning interventions that produced consequences their architects did not intend and could not have fully foreseen. Among the most discussed of these is the story of the mass vaccination campaigns of the 20th century, not the campaigns themselves, which have been among the most genuinely successful public health interventions in human history, but the specific instances within that broader history where particular vaccine preparations produced harms that the precautions of their era were not adequate to prevent. The Cutter incident of 1955, which took place in the weeks following the announcement of Jonas Salk's polio vaccine, and which represents one of the most carefully studied episodes of vaccine-related harm in the history of American public health, arose from a failure in the manufacturing process at the Cutter Laboratories in Berkeley, California, one of the companies licensed to produce the inactivated poliovirus vaccine that Salk had developed after years of work, and that had been shown in the largest clinical trial in American history, involving almost 2 million children in 1954, to be safe and effective against the disease that had paralyzed hundreds of thousands of children and adults in the post-war United States. The Cutter preparation, released in April of 1955, contained batches of vaccine in which the inactivation process had not been entirely successful, leaving live poliovirus present in the preparation. And the children who received these batches developed paralytic poliomyelitis at a rate that was quickly recognized as anomalous, leading to the recall of the vaccine within 2 weeks of its initial distribution. The Cutter incident resulted in approximately 200 cases of paralytic polio and 11 deaths, a toll that is sobering in itself. And that was particularly devastating, given the context of its occurrence. The euphoric national mood following the announcement of a successful vaccine against a disease that had stalked American summers for decades. The enormous public trust that had been invested in the vaccine program, and the fact that the harm occurred in the children who had been sent by their parents to receive protection from the very disease that was now harming them. The response of the American public health establishment to the Cutter incident was rapid and, in retrospect, reasonably effective in terms of limiting the immediate harm and strengthening the manufacturing and regulatory processes that governed subsequent vaccine production. But the episode left marks on the public trust in vaccination that persisted for years, contributing to a wariness about the safety of the very intervention that had done more than almost any other to reduce the burden of infectious disease in the 20th century. The careful historical analysis of the Cutter incident, most thoroughly undertaken by the medical historian Paul Offit in his 2005 book on the subject, demonstrates that the manufacturing failures that produced the contaminated batches were not the result of negligence or indifference, but of the genuine difficulty of scaling up a complex biological manufacturing process under the enormous time and social pressure that followed the announcement of the Salk vaccine's success, and of the limitations of the quality control methods available in 1955, which were not sophisticated enough to detect the very small quantities of live virus that the failed inactivation process had left in some batches. This does not make the harm any less real or the deaths any less deeply sorrowful, but it places them in the context of what was actually known and actually possible at the time of their occurrence, which is the only context in which historical events can be fairly understood. The story of the 1976 swine flu immunization program in the United States offers a somewhat different but equally instructive example of the complexities of public health decision-making and the possibility of intervention-related harm in a population health context. In early 1976, an outbreak of a novel influenza strain at Fort Dix in New Jersey caused the death of one soldier and raised concern among public health officials that the strain might be related to the influenza virus responsible for the catastrophic 1918 pandemic, which had killed an estimated 50 million to 100 million people worldwide, and which was understood of being caused by a strain with features similar to what was being observed at Fort Dix. The decision was made by the administration of President Gerald Ford on the advice of public health officials who were genuinely uncertain about the pandemic risk, but who believed the potential consequence of underreacting was far worse than the potential consequence of overreacting, to undertake a nationwide mass immunization program targeting the new swine flu strain, and within months, approximately 45 million Americans had received the swine flu vaccine. The anticipated pandemic did not materialize, the Fort Dix outbreak remaining limited to that installation, without spreading into the broader population, and the vaccine program was suspended in December 1976. Following the identification of an elevated rate of Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological condition causing ascending paralysis in vaccinated individuals compared to the unvaccinated population. The estimated excess risk of Guillain-Barré syndrome associated with the vaccine was approximately one additional case per 100,000 vaccinations, a small absolute risk, but one that was real, and that, in the absence of a pandemic that never arrived, represented a harm that the program had imposed on a healthy population without the balancing benefit that the program's architects had anticipated. The 1976 swine flu program has become, in the medical and public health literature, a standard reference point for the difficulties of making population-level decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty about the probability and severity of a future threat, and for the way in which the precautionary calculus of public health is fundamentally different from the calculus of individual clinical medicine, because the decisions are made not for a specific identified patient, but for a population whose members include both those who would benefit from the intervention and those who would be harmed by it, and the distribution of benefit and harm across those individuals cannot be determined in advance. The officials who recommended the 1976 program were not wrong to take the pandemic risk seriously, given what they knew about the 1918 pandemic and the apparent similarity of the Fort Dix strain. They were working with incomplete information, under time pressure, in a situation where the cost of inaction, if the pandemic had materialized, would have been catastrophically larger than the cost of action that the actual outcome revealed. This is again the story of medicine operating at the limit of available knowledge, making the best decision that the available evidence supports, and then being judged by the outcomes that actually occurred, rather than by the full distribution of outcomes that might have occurred, a distribution that includes the catastrophic pandemic that did not happen and that the decision makers were rightly trying to prevent. The night holds all of this lightly, as it holds all sorrowful things. And the soft distance of history makes it possible to understand these events with a compassion that the urgency of the moment they occurred did not always permit. The quiet of this hour invites us to move, gently and without haste, into a consideration of the category of medical harm that is perhaps the most intimate and the most difficult to trace, because it occurs not through the administration of a specific treatment or the recommendation of a specific procedure, but through the environment of care itself, through the conditions of the hospital and the clinic and the doctor's office, and through the practices and habits and organizational characteristics of the institutions within which medical care is delivered. This is the category of healthcare-associated infection. The infections acquired by patients in the course of receiving care in a medical setting, which are caused not by the diseases that brought the patients to the hospital, but by the microorganisms that inhabit the hospital environment and that take advantage of the vulnerabilities created by illness, by surgical wounds, by the insertion of catheters and tubes, and by the use of immunosuppressive medications to establish infections that would not otherwise have occurred. The recognition that hospitals were places where patients could acquire new and potentially fatal infections was not a discovery of the modern era. It was made with painful clarity and with professional consequences that were deeply unjust by the Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis, working in the Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s, who observed that the rate of childbed fever, a devastating postpartum infection that killed a significant proportion of women who delivered in the hospital's first obstetric clinic, was dramatically higher in that clinic, where deliveries were attended by medical students and physicians who came directly from performing autopsies in the pathology department, than in the second clinic, where deliveries were attended by midwives who did not perform autopsies. Semmelweis concluded in 1847 that some substance was being carried on the hands of the physicians and students from the cadavers to the laboring women, and that this substance was causing the childbed fever. And he instituted a policy of hand washing with chlorinated lime solution before each examination that reduced the mortality rate in the first clinic from approximately 10 to 12%, in some months higher, to below 2%. This intervention, which was correct in its reasoning and dramatic in its results, and which anticipated by nearly 2 decades the germ theory that would eventually provide the theoretical framework to explain it, was nevertheless rejected by most of the medical community of the era, partly because it lacked the theoretical explanation that would have made it intelligible within the prevailing frameworks of medical thinking, and partly because it implied that the physicians themselves, those careful and educated and socially prominent men, were responsible for the deaths of the patients they were treating, a suggestion that was, to many of those physicians, both personally offensive and professionally threatening. Semmelweis was unable to secure the institutional support and professional recognition that might have allowed his findings to spread and take root, and he left Vienna under circumstances that were a compound of professional failure and personal deterioration, and he died in 1865 in a mental institution in Vienna at the age of 47, possibly, and with a sorrowful irony that the history of medicine has not failed to note, of an infection of the kind that he had spent his career trying to prevent. His vindication came posthumously, as many vindications do, arriving after the person who deserved it most could no longer receive it, carried forward by the slow turning of the scientific world toward the truth he had been first to see. Joseph Lister, the British surgeon who developed antiseptic surgical technique in the 1860s on the basis of Pasteur's germ theory, acknowledged Semmelweis as a predecessor, and Florence Nightingale, whose work in the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856 had demonstrated that improving the sanitary conditions of military hospitals dramatically reduced the death rate among wounded soldiers, represented in her own career and her own data the same essential insight that Semmelweis had reached by a different route, the insight that the hospital environment was itself a source of harm as well as a site of healing, and that the practices and the physical conditions of that environment needed to be managed with the same care and the same empirical discipline as any other aspect of medical treatment. The history of hospital-acquired infection is, in this sense, there's the history of the slow and not yet completed process by which medicine has grappled with the implications of Semmelweis's discovery, learning and relearning across generations, the lesson that the hands that heal can also harm, and that the institutions of care carry within them the permanent possibility of adding to the suffering they were built to relieve. In the modern hospital, the descendants of the organisms that killed women in Semmelweis's obstetric clinic are still present, adapted and in some cases transformed by the very antibiotics that were developed to combat them into strains that resist treatment with greater tenacity than their predecessors, and that have acquired, through the selective pressure of decades of antibiotic use, the genetic capacity to survive in environments that the antibiotics of the mid-20th century would have rendered uninhabitable. The history of antibiotic resistance is, in the fullest sense, a story of medicine producing the conditions of its own partial defeat, using the tools of its greatest triumph in ways that have gradually eroded their effectiveness and created a population of microorganisms against which the pharmaceutical arsenal of the early 21st century is, in some cases, dangerously inadequate. The discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming in 1928 and its development as a practical therapeutic agent by Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain in the early 1940s represented the most genuinely transformative advance in the history of infectious disease treatment, a moment when the centuries-long contest between human illness and human medicine finally shifted decisively in medicine's favor, and the infections that had killed across all of human history, the pneumonias and the septicemias and the wound infections and the syphilis that Mercury had failed to reliably treat for 300 years, could suddenly be addressed with an agent that was both effective and, in its original formulations, relatively safe for the patients who received it. Fleming himself, accepting the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1945, alongside Florey and Chain, warned in his acceptance speech that the misuse of penicillin, its use in doses too small to fully eliminate the bacteria being treated, could lead to the selection of resistant strains, a warning that was scientifically prescient, and that the medical and agricultural systems of the subsequent decades were not well positioned to heed. For reasons that included the commercial pressures on antibiotic manufacturers, the genuine difficulty of persuading physicians and patients to complete full courses of treatment, and the vast and largely unregulated use of antibiotics in agriculture as growth promoters, a practice that created conditions of antibiotic exposure across billions of animals that were ideal for the selection and amplification of resistant strains. The development of resistance to each successive generation of antibiotics has followed a pattern that has become grimly familiar to the microbiologists and infectious disease specialists who track it. A pattern in which a new antibiotic agent is introduced with therapeutic optimism, achieves widespread clinical adoption, and then gradually loses effectiveness as the bacterial populations it targets evolve mechanisms to neutralize or evade it, mechanisms that spread with a speed and a facility that the evolutionary dynamics of microbial populations make possible in ways that have no parallel in the evolution of organisms with longer reproductive cycles. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, the organism known by the acronym MSTARSA, was first identified in 1961, the year after methicillin was introduced as a treatment for penicillin-resistant staphylococcal infections, and it has since become one of the most common causes of healthcare-associated infection in hospitals around the world, responsible for tens of thousands of deaths annually, and for a burden of illness and extended hospitalization that represents an enormous cost, both in human terms and in the economic terms of the healthcare systems that must manage it. Vancomycin-resistant enterococci, carbapenem-resistant enterobacteriaceae, and the various multidrug-resistant organisms that inhabit the intensive care units and long-term care facilities of the modern world represent successive chapters in the same story, the story of medicine's tools being turned by evolution against the purposes for which they were made, in a process that the policies governing antibiotic use have been too slow and too inconsistent to adequately counter. The World Health Organization published its first global action plan on antimicrobial resistance in 2015, acknowledging that the crisis of resistant organisms was one of the most significant threats to global health in the coming decades, a recognition that was correct and important, and that arrived in the context of decades of warnings from the scientific community that the actions taken to prevent it had been insufficient. It is a sorrowful irony of the kind that this catalogue has become accustomed to, that the antibiotics whose discovery saved so many millions of lives across the second half of the 20th century are now, through the manner of their use, contributing to a growing crisis of untreatable infection that represents a new chapter in the long history of medicine producing harms it did not intend and could not perhaps have entirely prevented. Let us rest here for a moment in the history of antimicrobial resistance. Not because the story is complete, since it is not complete and will not be complete for many years, but because the hour is quiet. And there is something in this particular chapter of the story that speaks to a dimension of medical harm that is different from all the others we have visited tonight, a dimension in which the harm is not the product of a specific decision or a specific treatment, but of the aggregate of millions of decisions made over decades, each individually reasonable, each individually defensible within the clinical logic of its moment, but collectively producing an outcome that none of the individual decision makers was trying to produce, and that the system as a whole was not organized to prevent. This is harm that arises not from the failure of individual judgment, but from the structure of the incentives and the information flows within which individual judgment operates, from the absence of mechanisms to make the cumulative consequences of individually reasonable decisions visible to the people making those decisions. The prescription of an antibiotic for a viral upper respiratory infection, a practice that was extremely common in the latter decades of the 20th century, and that remains more common than evidence-based guidelines, recommend does nothing to treat the viral illness for which it is prescribed, since antibiotics have no effect on viruses, but it does expose the bacteria present in the patient's body to subtherapeutic antibiotic pressure, contributing to the pool of selective pressure that drives the evolution of resistance. The individual physician who prescribes the antibiotic is not thinking about resistance evolution. They are thinking about this patient in this consultation with this set of symptoms, and the prescription is in many cases a response to the patient's expectations or to the physician's genuine uncertainty about whether the illness might have a bacterial component, and in the individual case, it does no dramatic harm to the individual patient, who may feel slightly better simply because they have received treatment and believe it is working. The harm is diffuse and delayed and distributed across a population and across time in ways that the individual clinical encounter cannot capture, and this is precisely why it has been so difficult to address, and why it continues to accumulate even in an era when the mechanisms of resistance are well understood and the evidence base for antibiotic stewardship is well established. Over the course of the 20th century, in the years and the decades following the great triumphs of the antibiotic era and the parallel triumphs of the vaccine era and the surgical revolution that had made complex operations routinely survivable for the first time in history, medicine developed a set of tools for examining its own practices that were more powerful than anything available in previous centuries, and the use of those tools produced, with increasing frequency and increasing scope, systematic reviews and meta-analyses and randomized controlled trials that revealed, in domain after domain, that established practices were less effective than their practitioners believed, that treatments widely regarded as standard of care were producing little measurable benefit in the populations receiving them, and that in some cases, the harm from the treatment exceeded the harm from the disease. The practice of routine episiotomy in obstetrics, the surgical incision made to widen the birth canal during delivery, was performed in the United States at rates approaching 70% of all vaginal deliveries during the 1970s and 1980s, on the basis of a theory that a clean surgical incision would heal better than the ragged tears that might otherwise occur, and that the procedure would prevent pelvic floor damage and improve outcomes for both mother and baby. The Cochrane Systematic Review, published in 2000, examining the best available evidence on this practice, found that routine episiotomy was not associated with the benefits its advocates had claimed, and was associated with greater rates of severe perineal trauma, greater rates of suturing, and longer healing times than a policy of restricting the procedure to cases where it was specifically indicated, leading to a substantial revision of obstetric guidelines and a significant decline in episiotomy rates over the following decade in countries where the evidence-based guidelines were implemented. This is, in the larger context of our catalogue, a relatively modest story of a single obstetric intervention, revised on the basis of better evidence, but it illustrates in miniature the mechanism by which the tools of evidence-based medicine, when applied consistently and without the distorting influence of professional or commercial interests, are capable of identifying and correcting the harms produced by well-intentioned but inadequately examined practices. The broader movement known as evidence-based medicine, which is most closely associated with the work of the Canadian physician David Sackett and the epidemiologist Archibald Cochrane, whose 1972 book Effectiveness and Efficiency, Random Reflections on Health Services, argued with characteristic directness that the medical profession had an ethical obligation to evaluate its practices with rigorous evidence and to cease performing those that could not be shown to be effective, represented in some ways the culmination of the epistemological project that Pierre-Louis had begun with his numerical method in the 1820s, and that James Lind had sketched in outline in his 1747 trial of scurvy remedies. The Cochrane collaboration, founded in 1993 in honor of Archie Cochrane, and dedicated to the production and dissemination of systematic reviews of the evidence for medical interventions, has produced thousands of reviews across virtually every domain of medical practice, and the cumulative effect of those reviews has been a substantial revision of the evidence base for medicine, with many practices that were previously standard being identified as ineffective or harmful, and with a gradual but genuine shift in the culture of medical decision-making toward the integration of systematic evidence alongside individual clinical expertise. This process is not complete, and the gap between the best available evidence and the practices actually employed in clinical medicine remains, in many areas, substantial and sobering. But the existence of the process, the existence of a systematic and institutionalized mechanism for subjecting medical practices to empirical scrutiny and for disseminating the results of that scrutiny to the practitioners who perform those practices, represents a genuine advance over the situation in any previous century, a genuine change in the relationship between medicine and its own fallibility. It is worth noting, in this gentle consideration of evidence-based medicine and its contributions, that the movement has its own critics and its own limitations, and that the application of systematic review methodology to medical practice raises questions that do not always have straightforward answers. The randomized controlled trial, which is the gold standard of evidence in the evidence-based medicine framework, is extraordinarily powerful for evaluating the average effect of a treatment in a defined population of patients who meet specific inclusion criteria, but it is less well suited to capturing the variability of treatment effects across the full range of patients who will actually receive the treatment in clinical practice, and it is less well suited to addressing the qualitative dimensions of the patient experience, the values and preferences and individual circumstances that the practicing physician must weigh alongside the statistical findings of the trial when making a treatment decision for a specific person sitting across the desk from them. The philosopher and physician Sir John Wenberg, whose work at Dartmouth on geographic variation in medical practice became one of the foundational documents of the evidence-based medicine movement, was also careful to note that the variation in practice patterns he documented was not simply the result of ignorance or irrationality on the part of the physicians who practiced differently from one another, but in many cases reflected genuine uncertainty in the evidence base and genuine differences in the values that patients in different communities brought to medical decisions, differences that systematic reviews could not fully resolve. This nuance, which is important and true, does not diminish the value of systematic evidence. But it is a reminder that the tools of evidence-based medicine Like all the tools that medicine has developed across its long history, are powerful and important and genuinely valuable, and also limited and also capable of being misapplied, and also in need of the same kind of humble and ongoing scrutiny that they were designed to bring to the practices they evaluate. And so we arrive, gently and without rushing, at the consideration of what this long catalogue of medical harm means, not in the forensic sense of assigning responsibility or tallying the costs, but in the quieter and more reflective sense of what it tells us about the nature of medicine as a human enterprise, about the relationship between knowledge and action, and about the particular kind of humility that the practice of healing demands and does not always receive. The physicians who bled George Washington in December of 1799 were not different in kind from the physicians who prescribed OxyContin in 1998, or the surgeons who performed radical mastectomies in 1965, or the regulatory officials who approved thalidomide for use in pregnant women in 1958. They were all people working at the edge of what was known, making decisions that the frameworks of their era told them were correct, and in some cases paying insufficient attention to the evidence that those frameworks were incomplete or wrong. The difference between them is not the difference between ignorance and knowledge, since all of these eras had medical knowledge of a kind, but the difference between different states of that knowledge, different degrees of its incompleteness, different tools for examining its gaps and revising its errors. What persists across all of them, the thread that runs from Galen to the opioid crisis, is the asymmetry between the confidence of the practitioner and the vulnerability of the patient, the asymmetry that makes the patient's trust in the physician a source of both healing and, when the physician's knowledge fails, of harm, and that places on the practitioner a responsibility to acknowledge uncertainty that the culture of medicine has not always made easy or comfortable to fulfill. In the hospitals and clinics of the early 21st century, the legacy of all these histories is present in the design of the systems and the practices and the institutions that govern medical care, though not always in ways that are visible or explicitly acknowledged. The requirement for informed consent before medical procedures, the obligation to explain to patients what is known and what is uncertain about a proposed treatment, and to obtain their agreement before proceeding, grew in large part from the recognition of the harm that had been caused in previous eras by the unilateral decisions of physicians who did not consider the patient's autonomous preferences to be relevant to the treatment decision. The systems of pharmacovigilance, the post-market surveillance mechanisms that collect reports of adverse drug reactions and that allow regulatory agencies to identify safety signals that were not apparent in pre-approval trials, were built in response to the thalidomide tragedy and its successors, to ensure that the limited evidence available at the time of a drug's approval was supplemented by ongoing monitoring of its effects in the real world population of people who took it. The ethics review boards and institutional review committees that oversee research involving human subjects, requiring that studies be designed with adequate safeguards, and that participants be fully informed of the risks of participation, reflect the hard lessons of the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which the United States Public Health Service observed the natural progression of untreated syphilis in 399 black men in Alabama from 1932 to 1972, withholding effective treatment even after penicillin became available in the 1940s, a study that represents one of the most egregious violations of medical ethics in American history, and that left a legacy of mistrust in the relationship between the African American community and the medical establishment that persists to this day and that has measurable consequences for healthcare utilization and health outcomes in that community. The Tuskegee study, which was conducted under the auspices of the United States federal government, and which was reviewed and continued by successive cohorts of public health officials over the 4 decades of its existence, is in some ways the hardest chapter of this catalogue to discuss with equanimity, because it involves not simply the harm that arises from well-meaning error, but something closer to the deliberate withholding of care from a vulnerable population for the purposes of a study whose scientific value was, even at the time of its initiation in 1932, questionable. The men who participated in the study, recruited from Macon County, Alabama, one of the poorest counties in one of the poorest states in the country, were told that they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a colloquial term that covered a range of ailments, and they were provided with some medical care, and with meals, and with burial insurance, incentives that made participation attractive in the context of the severe poverty and the severe lack of access to medical care that characterized their lives. They were not told they were participating in a study of untreated syphilis. They were not told that effective treatment was available and being withheld from them. And when penicillin became the standard of care for syphilis in the mid-1940s, the study continued without providing it to the men who were its subjects, a decision that was made not in ignorance of penicillin's effectiveness, but in full awareness of it by public health officials who prioritized the scientific objective of observing the natural history of untreated disease over the medical obligation to treat the disease they were observing. The study was ended only in 1972, following a leak of its existence to the journalist Jean Heller and the subsequent public outcry that followed her reporting, and by that time, 28 of the original participants had died directly from syphilis. 100 had died from related complications. 40 of their wives had been infected with the disease, and 19 of their children had been born with congenital syphilis, a toll of preventable suffering that carries a weight that no amount of careful historical framing can entirely lift. The National Research Act of 1974, passed in response to the public revelation of the Tuskegee study, created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which produced the Belmont Report in 1979, establishing the 3 fundamental ethical principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice that have governed the ethical review of human subjects research in the United States ever since. These principles, and the institutional frameworks built around them, represent a genuine and important response to a genuine and important failure, an attempt to build into the structure of research. That's the ethical safeguards that individual judgment and professional culture had proved insufficient to maintain. They are not perfect, and the history of research ethics since 1979 includes episodes that demonstrate the ongoing difficulty of translating ethical principles into reliable protective practice. But they are real, and they matter, and they represent one of the clearest examples in the history of medicine of a specific harm being translated into a specific structural protection of the past being made to serve the future in a way that honors the suffering of those who experienced it. The night is very deep now, very quiet, and we have traveled very far together through this long and sorrowful and ultimately instructive catalogue, and it is time to begin the movement toward morning, toward the soft light that will come eventually even to the darkest hours. There is a quality to the very late hours of the night, a quality that is different from the early evening darkness and different from the pre-dawn grey, a quality of deep stillness in which the ordinary sounds of the world have reached their lowest ebb, and the mind, if it is not entirely at rest, is at least quieter than it is at any other time of day, more open to the patient movement of thought that does not press toward conclusion, but simply follows where the material leads. In this quality of stillness, it is possible to consider one more dimension of the history we have been tracing tonight, the dimension of what medicine has learned about itself through the process of making and recognizing and attempting to correct its errors, and what that learning might mean for the future of the enterprise, for the patients who will come to physicians in the decades and centuries ahead, and who will receive treatments that those physicians believe on the basis of the best available evidence to be correct, and who will, in some cases, be harmed by those treatments in ways that the physicians and the patients and the regulatory systems of the era cannot yet perceive. The concept of medical humility, the institutionalized acknowledgement that current knowledge is always incomplete and current practices always provisional, is perhaps the most important legacy of the history this catalogue has traced, more important than any specific lesson about any specific treatment, because it is a meta-lesson, a lesson about the nature of medical knowledge itself, rather than about any particular domain of its application, and it is a lesson that has to be learned and relearned by each generation of practitioners, because the confidence that knowledge generates tends always to run a little ahead of the knowledge itself, and the gap between them is where the harms we have been counting live. The physician Atul Gawande, writing in his 2002 book, Complications, A Surgeon's Notes on an Imperfect Science, described the experience of making mistakes in medicine with a directness and a personal honesty that is rare in a professional culture not well designed to encourage such disclosures, and his description of the way in which surgical errors are embedded in the normal experience of surgical practice, not as exceptional failures, but as ordinary features of a craft that cannot be practiced without them, offers a perspective on medical fallibility that is both more realistic and more compassionate than the extreme positions that the history of medical harm sometimes generates, the position that celebrates medicine's achievements without acknowledging its errors, and the position that catalogues its errors without acknowledging its achievements. The honest accounting that Gawande attempted in his writing is, in miniature, the same honest accounting that this catalogue has been attempting across the broader span of medical history. And the lesson of both, if there is a single lesson, is something like this: that the practice of medicine is an irreducibly human enterprise, practiced by people with incomplete knowledge and genuine intentions in a world that is far more complex than any of our models of it, and that the appropriate response to this fact is neither despair nor uncritical celebration, but rather the ongoing, patient, humble work of trying to do better, of using the tools of evidence and ethics and institutional design to close the gap between what medicine intends and what medicine achieves, one carefully studied question at a time. This is not a comfortable lesson, and it is not a complete one, but it is, in the long view of the history we have been tracing together tonight, the truest one available. During the early years of the 21st century, as the systematic review movement gathered evidence and the opioid crisis accumulated its devastating statistics, and the crisis of antimicrobial resistance made its slow progress toward the center of public health concern, A quieter revolution was taking place in the way that medicine thought about the relationship between treatment and harm. A revolution associated most closely with the work of researchers in patient safety, a field that had been catalyzed by the publication in 1999 of the report "To Err is Human" by the United States Institute of Medicine, which estimated that between 44,000 and 98,000 Americans died each year as a result of preventable medical errors in hospitals, a figure that, whatever its precise accuracy, was large enough and credible enough to generate a public and professional response that had not been generated by the various preceding analyses of medical harm, and that established patient safety as a recognized and explicitly named discipline within the broader enterprise of healthcare. The report drew on the work of researchers like Lucian Lippi, whose 1994 paper Error in Medicine in the Journal of the American Medical Association had argued that the culture of medicine, with its emphasis on individual responsibility and its tendency to respond to errors with blame rather than systems analysis, was ill-suited to producing the improvements in safety that the scale of the problem demanded, and that the appropriate model for medical safety was not the judicial model of identifying and punishing the responsible individual, but the industrial model developed in high reliability organizations like aviation, in which errors were analyzed as system failures, as the products of the complex interactions between human judgment and organizational design and physical environment, and in which the appropriate response was the redesign of the systems rather than the punishment of the people operating within them. This shift in framing, from individual culpability to systems failure, was not universally embraced by the medical profession, since it ran against deep traditions of professional accountability and personal responsibility. But it was important and real, and it has produced, over the subsequent decades, a substantial body of research and practical innovation in areas like surgical checklists, medication reconciliation systems, infection prevention protocols, and the design of communication processes in healthcare settings that have measurably reduced specific categories of preventable harm in the hospitals that have implemented them. The surgical safety checklist, developed by Atul Gawande and his colleagues at the World Health Organization, and introduced in a pilot study across 8 hospitals on 4 continents in 2007 and 2008, demonstrated that a simple list of verification steps performed before and during surgical procedures could reduce the rate of major post-operative complications by a third, and the rate of deaths by almost half, a result of such magnitude and such simplicity that it was, for those who encountered it for the first time, nearly difficult to believe. The checklist required no new technology and no new knowledge and no new drugs. It required only that the team performing the surgery confirm, aloud and in a structured sequence, that certain basic precautions had been taken, that the correct patient was on the table, that the correct site had been marked, that the necessary equipment was available, that the anesthesiologist had reviewed the patient's known allergies. These were things that every experienced surgical team knew to do and believed they were doing, and the demonstration that a formal, structured verification process reduced complications and deaths was, in retrospect, a demonstration of something important about the gap between what people intend to do and what the cognitive and organizational realities of a busy, operating theatre actually make possible without structural support. The checklist is now used in hospitals around the world and has become one of the most cited examples of patient safety improvement in the literature of the field, And it represents, in the context of this long catalogue of medical harm, one of the most encouraging chapters, because it shows that the lessons of history can be translated into practical tools, that the recognition of a category of harm can lead directly to a method for preventing it, and that the improvement of medicine is a project that, however slowly and unevenly it proceeds, does actually proceed. And yet, even as the patient safety movement was demonstrating what could be achieved through systematic attention to error and the redesign of systems, new forms of harm were emerging in the landscape of modern medicine that the old frameworks were not well designed to address. New forms arising from the very technologies and capabilities that represented medicine's most celebrated advances. The proliferation of diagnostic imaging, made possible by the development of computed tomography in the 1970s and magnetic resonance imaging in the 1980s, and the progressive refinement of both technologies in the subsequent decades, has created possibilities for detecting pathology at a level of resolution and a stage of development that was simply not available in any previous era of medicine, and this capacity for early and detailed detection has produced, alongside its genuine benefits, a new category of harm that researchers have come to call overdiagnosis, the identification and treatment of conditions that would never have caused symptoms or death in the patient's lifetime, but that, once identified, generate a clinical momentum toward treatment that can produce more harm than the condition itself would have caused if left undetected. The discovery on a computed tomography scan, performed for an entirely different indication, of a small nodule in the lung, or a small mass in the thyroid, or an incidental finding in the kidney or the adrenal gland, sets in motion a process of further investigation and often treatment that carries its own risks. The risks of biopsy procedures and surgical excision and radiological follow-up, and the psychological burden of living under surveillance for a condition that may, had it never been discovered, have remained entirely inconsequential across the remainder of the patient's natural life. The history of thyroid cancer diagnosis in the United States and in several other countries in the late 20th and early 21st centuries offers one of the most carefully documented examples of overdiagnosis in the modern medical literature, with rates of thyroid cancer diagnosis increasing dramatically over the period from the 1970s to the 2010s, in ways that were not accompanied by any increase in the rate of death from thyroid cancer, strongly suggesting that the increased diagnoses represented not an increase in the true burden of thyroid cancer in the population, but an increase in the detection of small papillary thyroid cancers, a type of thyroid cancer that is extremely common in the general population on autopsy studies, and that appears, in the vast majority of cases, to be entirely indolent and clinically insignificant throughout the person's lifetime. The researchers H. Gilbert Welch and William Black, who have written extensively about overdiagnosis in the American medical literature, estimated in a 2010 paper that the increase in thyroid cancer diagnosis in the United States between 1973 and 2002 represented primarily the detection and treatment of cancers that would never have caused harm, and that the surgical treatment of these cancers, which typically involved thyroidectomy and subsequent lifelong thyroid hormone replacement therapy, carried risks and burdens that were not justified by the minimal benefit of treating cancers that would not have produced illness or death in their absence. This finding was not universally accepted, and the clinical management of small thyroid nodules and early thyroid cancer remains an area of active debate in the endocrinology and surgical literature. But the concept of overdiagnosis that it exemplifies has become an important and legitimate concern in the evidence-based medicine literature. A reminder that the capacity to detect is not always identical to the imperative to treat, and that the extension of medicine's reach through new diagnostic technologies can produce harms of a new and unfamiliar kind. The concept of overdiagnosis is, in this sense, the 21st century's contribution to the long catalogue we have been building tonight, a new chapter in the story of cures that cause more harm than they prevent, written not with lancets and bleeding bowls, but with high-resolution scanners and sensitive biomarkers, and the enormous computational power that modern medicine can bring to bear on the task of finding disease in human bodies, sometimes finding it where it lives harmlessly, and where the finding itself and the treatment it initiates becomes the source of the harm. It is a deeply ironic chapter, arising as it does from the success of the diagnostic enterprise, rather than from its failure, from the unprecedented ability to see inside the body and to identify changes that would have been invisible in any previous era, and finding in that ability not only the expected benefits of early and accurate diagnosis, but also the unexpected costs of a medical gaze. So penetrating that it discovers conditions which medicines then feels obligated to treat, even when the evidence for benefit from treatment is inadequate. The physicians who order the scans and who receive the reports and who discuss the findings with their patients are, in most cases, acting in good faith and within the standard of care of their era. Just as the physicians who applied the lancet and the physicians who prescribed mercury and the physicians who performed radical mastectomies were acting in good faith and within the standard of care of their eras. The standard of care changes, the faith remains. And the gap between the two, the gap between the confidence that the standard of care is correct and the evidence that it sometimes isn't, persists as the permanent condition of medicine in any era. The condition that this long night's catalogue has been quietly illuminating from its first chapter to its last. As the hour deepens and the night moves toward its furthest point from dawn, it is possible to hold all of these stories together. The bleedings and the mercuries and the surgeries and the pharmaceuticals and the diagnostic overreaches, not as a catalogue of failure, but as a kind of map. A map of the territory between human suffering and human knowledge, of the difficult ground that medicine has always had to traverse between what patients need and what practitioners can provide, of the mistakes that mark that ground like cairns, each one placed there by a generation that moved through a darkness that the next generation's light would partially illuminate and partially leave in shadow for the generation after that. The map is not complete. It will never be complete, because human medicine is a living practice, and living practices do not arrive at completion. They continue, they change, they discover and they err, and they correct, and they discover again, in a process that has no ending point and no final destination, but only the next patient and the next question and the next attempt to close the gap between intention and outcome, between care and cure, between the physician who extends a hand toward the sick and the sick who reach back toward that hand across the distance of their suffering. This is the practice of medicine. This is its history. This is, in the end, what all of these chapters have been about. The candle in this room has burned very low now, and the flame is small and steady, casting its soft and particular light across the surface of everything within reach, touching the edges of things without fully illuminating them, the way the past touches the present, gently and incompletely, and with the warmth of something that was once alive and is now becoming something else. We have traveled a very long way tonight, you and I, from the earliest bleedings of antiquity to the overdiagnosis debates of the 21st century, from the mercury baths of the syphilis wards to the lobotomy theatres of Walter Freeman, from the thalidomide pharmacies of 1950s Europe to the opioid prescription pads of 1990s America. And in all of these places, we have found the same essential quality of human effort. Imperfect and genuine and persistent, always reaching toward healing, and sometimes, through the very act of reaching, producing harm. The story is not a comfortable one, but it is an honest one. And honesty has its own kind of comfort. The comfort of not being deceived, of not being asked to believe that the world is simpler or kinder, or more easily navigated than it actually is. And perhaps there is comfort, too, in the recognition that the errors we have catalogued were not the last word. That the history of medicine is also a history of correction, of the slow and imperfect and genuine progress toward a practice that harms less and helps more, that the patient safety movement and the evidence-based medicine movement and the pharmacovigilance systems and the ethics review boards and all of the other mechanisms that the medical world has built in response to its own failures represent real advances, real reductions in the distance between intention and outcome, real improvements in the condition of patients who receive care today compared to patients who received care in any previous era. And here, at the very end of this long journey through the sorrows and the sincerely intended errors of medical history, the voice grows quieter and the words come more slowly, and the night itself seems to settle more deeply around whatever space you are in right now, the room or the bed or the quiet corner where you have been listening to this long, slow telling. The diseases are far away now. The physicians and their remedies have receded into the past, into the great patient archive of human experience, where everything that has happened rests in the particular piece of the irrevocably finished. The bleeding bowls are still. The mercury has cooled. The operating theatres of Halstead are dark and silent. The lobotomy instruments are in their museum cases. And here you are, in the present, which is the only place that is fully real and fully yours. Breathing slowly and feeling the weight of your body against whatever surface supports it. And the past is simply the past, not a threat and not a burden, but simply the long story of where we have all come from, the story of what human beings have done and learned and suffered and survived across the centuries of their attempts to care for one another. Let it drift away from you now. That long story, the way a river carries whatever it has been given downstream into the distance, gently and without effort, leaving the surface of the water clear and still, and reflecting, in whatever light there is, the quiet of the sky. You are safe here. You are resting. The history has been told, and the night holds it now. And you can let everything go, slowly and completely, breathing out the last of whatever you were carrying, and simply rest, here in this present moment, while the past dreams quietly in its own deep sleep, far away and long ago, and the darkness around you is soft and warm and complete.